Welcome to my channel. Hogwarts. I'm practically a culinary master, and only now they're calling me to Hogwarts. Chapter 21. Draco Malfoy loudly plotted, saying to Goyle, "You're in charge of forging a letter, saying that Luke Graves's breakfast-selling business has been discovered by the school's professors, and he needs to go to the dungeons for questioning. Remember, the letter paper must self-incinerate. Absolutely no evidence can be left behind." Goyle nodded. "Got it, boss." Malfoy, still uneasy, said, "You need to keep an eye on Luke and make sure he actually enters the dungeons." Goyle continued to nod. Malfoy then turned to Crabbe. "You're responsible for pouring all the super glue into the keyhole after Luke enters the dungeons. I want to make sure Luke absolutely cannot open the door. Once we have him trapped, you'll be in charge of gathering the young wizards nearby. Make sure to make a big scene so that the professors are determined to punish Luke." Crabbe smiled. "Boss, when it comes to being bad, it has to be you." Draco immediately slapped Crabbe on the head. "What the hell are you talking about? This is a scheme." Then, he turned and walked away. Goyle and Crabbe were both a bit confused, asking, "What about you, boss?" Draco waved his hand without looking back, saying, "I'm naturally in charge of finding Professor Snape. Professor Snape's help is still needed in the whole process, only Ardeen can control the situation." Draco walked away gracefully, while Goyle and Crabbe looked on with admiration. Sure enough, they hadn't followed the wrong person. Being a fair-weather friend and having bad ideas, the House of Malfoy was famous for these two things. Only those with active minds like them could thrive. Luke closed his alchemy grimoire. His efforts for breakfast today were truly not in vain. The magic emotional value harvested from the delicious food alone brought him closer to several of his goals. It was a truly fulfilling morning. Luke tidied up and washed, while Shyvana, dressed in her maid's uniform, meticulously helped him with his attire. Luke had no choice but to let Shyvana meticulously fuss over him. "Shyvana, you don't have to do this. I'm studying here now. Although you are the head maid, it's really not appropriate for you to be in the male dormitories. Even though you can transform into an owl, it's a bit too restrictive for you." Shyvana, however, looked at him with determination. "Young master, serving you is my duty. No one else is here. If I don't look after you, you'll wear yourself out sooner or later." Seeing Shyvana's persistence, Luke found it hard to say anything more. Under the current circumstances, sending Shyvana to the Ollery as an owl was something he would never consider. But having Shyvana stay by his side indeed presented many inconveniences. Luke's mind constantly churned, imagining ways to solve the problem. A moment later, he had an idea. Given the current situation, there were two ways that might solve the current problem. The first was to learn the extension charm. If he mastered the extension charm, he could expand a unique space that would allow Shyvana to remain unnoticed and also expand his resting place. It would be even better if this place could be carried with him. Luke silently pondered the feasibility of this matter. As an advanced magic technique, the extension charm was clearly not that easy to master. Moreover, the learning resources for this spell were close to the restricted section of the library. If he, as a first year, went there rashly, it would definitely attract attention. Just the librarian, Madame Pants, would probably be difficult to fool. He would probably also need to find a way to get authorization from the professors, otherwise he couldn't justifiably approach that area to learn the spell. As for the second plan, its feasibility was also good. If he remembered correctly, there was a magical place in the school called the Room of Requirement. Deep within the Room of Requirement, there seemed to be a cabinet called the Vanishing Cabinet. It could form a unique circuit passage with another cabinet in Borgin and Burke's in Nocturne Alley. Without this cabinet, old Dumbledore would definitely not have gone offline so easily. Although this was within his expectations. If he could get these two cabinets and modify them slightly, he might be able to create a direct portal. One side would be placed at Graves Manor, and the other by his side. Then, whether it was returning or letting Shyvana rest, it could become smoother and more convenient. However, the Vanishing Cabinet was not that easy to obtain. Moreover, Graves Manor had no protection whatsoever, and his maids were all ordinary muggles. Whether they could withstand teleportation was still unknown. So there was still a lot to learn at present. Thinking of this, Luke couldn't help but feel full of confidence. It seemed he had to fully develop and promote his gourmet career. Just as he was about to leave, an owl suddenly flew to the door. Upon seeing him, it instantly released the envelope it held in its beak. A short letter fell into Luke's hand. Mr. Graves, unauthorized selling of items is prohibited on campus. In view of your conduct, please proceed to the dungeons as soon as possible to be questioned by the professors. Luke immediately frowned. Has the school noticed so quickly? He had originally thought it would take at least a few more days for the professors to catch on. For some reason, he suddenly had a feeling of smelling a conspiracy. Although this feeling was faint and he couldn't pinpoint why. It made him wary. Perhaps the dungeons made him a little uneasy. Thinking this, Luke asked Shyvana to stay in the room. After all, if it really was an interview with the professors, they might spot Shyvana's flaws, so he had Shyvana stay behind and walk towards the dungeons himself. He would meet whatever came his way. He had to see what the situation was. After all, with the emotional value he had harvested, he also had a bit of confidence. Boss, everything is normal. Luke headed towards the dungeons, with Goyle stealthily following behind him. Everything was proceeding as Draco had envisioned. When Draco heard that Goyle had completed his task, he immediately smiled triumphantly. He walked towards Professor Snape's office next to the potion classroom and knocked on the somewhat damp wooden door. Professor, I have something to report. Snape was a little surprised. The one knocking on the door was none other than Draco of the House of Malfoy. Although Snape's expression was grim, he continued to brew an unknown potion with his wand in one hand, while coldly asking without looking up. Draco, you'd better have something important to tell me, otherwise knocking on a professor's door so casually might be a bit impolite. Draco looked slightly awkward, but still raised his head and said to Snape. Professor, I heard that the Hufflepuff student, Luke Graves, was privately selling breakfast in the common room, causing quite a bit of chaos for the school. And I also heard that he secretly snuck into the dungeons, attempting to steal some contraband. As a member of Slytherin, I absolutely cannot stand by and do nothing when faced with such a brazen fellow. Professor, please go and catch him in the act. I believe he will definitely not escape your brilliant enforcement. Snape looked up and stared at Draco. His slightly greasy hair looked somewhat sticky. Draco felt a bit unnerved by Snape's glare, but he still stubbornly looked at Snape. Professor, I think you'll agree. After all, my father, Lucius Malfoy, once said that you are a trustworthy professor, aren't you? Snape's grim expression deepened a notch. I hope what you say is true. Don't let it happen again. Snape stood up. Draco's eyes were full of triumph. Professor Snape's robes flapped like a giant bat. His steps were extremely hurried. Malfoy followed behind him, having to jog to keep up. Filch, who was coming from the opposite direction, saw Professor Snape's appearance and immediately hugged Madame Norris tightly, trotting to catch up. Professor, I heard you're catching young wizards who are breaking rules and regulations. I'd be delighted to assist you. Professor Snape merely gave him a cold glance, seemingly without a response. But Filch continued to follow. It was as if they had all planned it beforehand. Young wizards kept peeking out. Malfoy, walking alongside, smiled even wider. Perhaps because the commotion was too great, even Professor McGonagall, who was preparing for her class, was startled. Professor McGonagall. Seeing McGonagall Minerva, Professor Snape was a little surprised, but he only nodded and continued walking. Professor McGonagall, however, frowned, her long hair meticulously combed back. What's going on? She then scanned the many young wizards around her and said sternly. Don't any of you have classes? What are you all gathered here for? Although Professor McGonagall's tone was strict, the surrounding young wizards were unwilling to leave. Professor McGonagall could only follow their steps, heading towards the dungeons. She was actually puzzled, although she had heard that this matter seemed to be related to Luke. But what exactly did Luke do to make Professor Snape go to such great lengths? And this group of young wizards around also seemed to know something. Although she thought highly of Luke, when she heard that Luke had broken rules and regulations, even secretly sneaking into the dungeons, she couldn't help but frown. If it were really true, she wouldn't be able to say much on Luke's behalf. Hermione, who was originally reading on the lawn outside the school, saw Ron and Harry running with unusual urgency from afar. She immediately shook her head. With a sigh of exasperation, she buried her head back in her book. These boys are always so impulsive. It's such a waste not to use this precious time for studying, Hermione muttered to herself. Harry Potter and Ron Weasley's interactions and friendship with her were almost entirely established on the train because of Luke. Seeing their actions, Hermione didn't want to bother with them. Never mind, as long as they didn't affect her, she felt there was no need to pay attention. However, Ron, from a distance, was extremely sharp-eyed. He saw Hermione and immediately shouted, "Hermione Granger, come quickly." Hermione listened to Ron's boisterous voice and immediately felt a headache coming on. Ron was always impulsive and noisy, which was annoying. She deliberately moved to the side, pretending not to hear him. However, Ron seemed to have no intention of giving up and actually ran over with Harry. "Hermione, something's happened. Come with us." Hermione immediately got a headache and said with a frown, "What do you two want to do so early in the morning? Although it's only been a few days since school started, I want you to know that the longer you put off studying, the harder it will be to keep up." Hermione earnestly analyzed the future situation for the two of them, but Ron interrupted. "Although I know everything you're saying is reasonable, right now, hurry up and come with us." Hermione shook her head and said to Ron, "You two go play by yourselves, I want to read now." Ron's face turned a bit red, while Harry quickly said from the side, "Luke is in trouble. I heard Malfoy said Luke broke rules and regulations, and secretly snuck into the school dungeons, and it seems he was caught red-handed. Now, I hear Professor Snape and Professor McGonagall have already rushed over. Luke is probably in big trouble." Hermione, who had been indifferent, suddenly widened her eyes and stood up with a whoosh. "What did you two say?" Seeing Hermione's big reaction, Ron immediately muttered from the side, "Didn't you say you wanted to read? Why such a big reaction?" Hermione angrily slammed her book shut. She tapped Ron on the side. "That's Luke. We're all good friends with him. Are you going to just stand by and watch him be framed? I believe Luke is innocent, there must be some reason everyone misunderstood. Now. Immediately. Let's go." Hermione's urgency made the two boys look at each other in dismay. Ron stuck out his tongue. "It seems Luke is more effective than anything." Harry whispered to Ron beside him. "The dungeons, normally, who would go there except young wizards being punished? Now they're saying Luke went into those dungeons to steal house items. I wouldn't believe it even if you beat me. Anyway, no matter what, we have to help Luke with this. After all, we've benefited quite a bit from Luke, and I think he's a good person." Ron nodded from the side. "None of us Gryffindor students are ever cowards. If there's really no other way, then we'll all go up and help out, at least to share some of the pressure. Otherwise, if Luke gets expelled, it would be terrible." Harry nodded from the side, and the three rushed towards the dungeons. Hermione led the way. The area outside the dungeons quickly filled with young wizards. Even Professor McGonagall couldn't help but be surprised. The situation seemed a bit too deliberate. Such an out-of-the-way place as the dungeons definitely shouldn't attract so many young wizards. She frowned. Professor Snape, meanwhile, turned to Draco Malfoy and asked, "Are you sure Luke entered the dungeons?" Draco nodded vigorously, looking at the many gazes directed at him, and said, "I heard Luke sneaked into the dungeons. He definitely has an ulterior motive. Professor Snape, you just need to catch him and interrogate him, and you'll get the answer." Seeing everyone's intense gaze, Professor Snape was about to open the door. Harry and Ron, who had just rushed over from behind, immediately pushed through the crowd and stood in front of Professor Snape. "Professor, if you need help cleaning the dungeons, a few of us can assist. The dungeons are usually a place people only go to when they've made mistakes. Who would come here to explore? Professor McGonagall, I don't think Luke could possibly be here." Hermione also stepped forward. "Professor, this isn't that big of a deal to begin with. Now, so many young wizards are blocking the way here, even disrupting the class schedule. I believe the most important thing right now is to get the young wizards back on track into their respective classes." Minerva McGonagall nodded subtly from the side, her gaze sweeping over the surrounding young wizards. And the young wizards, meanwhile, were enjoying the spectacle. Hufflepuff students also swarmed forward, saying to Professor McGonagall, "Professor, Luke is of excellent character. We believe he would never do anything illegal or disorderly. The Hufflepuff students spoke up one after another. Intentionally or unintentionally, they blocked the other house students, giving Professor McGonagall an immediate headache. Snape, meanwhile, swept his gaze over the crowd, making everyone feel the surrounding atmosphere turn slightly cold and ominous. Snape sneered. Once the door is opened, everything will naturally be revealed. I will absolutely not show leniency toward students who break the rules. McGonagall remained silent. Harry and Ron wanted to say more. Snape's icy glare immediately swept over them. However, when he made eye contact with Harry at close range, Snape's gaze seemed to momentarily lose focus. A moment later, he casually reverted to his stern demeanor. Enough. Put away your tricks. Gryffindor students, as always, love to poke their noses into other people's business. Gryffindor, 1-point deduction. Snape did not look up. Professor McGonagall, standing beside him, pursed her lips but said nothing. After all, when it came down to it, Luke was in the wrong. And the actions of Harry and the others were too obvious. The staircase leading down to the dungeons was completely blocked. Luke, who had arrived at the dungeon early, showed a playful look in his eyes. This was because there was no one else in the entire dungeon. Immediately upon entering, Luke discovered the problem. Clearly, this was a trap set for him. If he had to guess who was most likely, who could it be but Draco Malfoy? Yet, there wasn't a single person around. This meant that if it was Draco's trap, he would definitely have someone block him in here. As Luke thought this, he heard the dungeon door suddenly click shut. As expected, Luke tried to open the door but found it firmly locked. Luke immediately showed a look of realization. Just as he suspected, Malfoy was acting out of shame and anger. Luke's mind raced. The next moment, he drew his wand and waved it toward the door. Alohomora. Alohomora. With enough emotional value, his speed in learning spells was once again soaring like a winged plane. Simple spells like the unlocking charm were child's play for Luke. The bolt clicked, but Luke found that the entire door remained firmly fixed in place, showing no sign of opening. Luke's eyes showed understanding. Sure enough, it wasn't that easy. Malfoy had some wits about him. Unless he could force the door open, it wouldn't be easy to unlock. Since Malfoy designed this situation, he likely had a backup plan. Luke had wounded Malfoy's pride, and the other party was also obsessed with getting Shyvana. Therefore, Malfoy likely harbored some perverse and stubborn ideas. It seemed it was time to properly discipline Malfoy. Otherwise, this guy would never stop with his petty schemes. Thinking this, Luke immediately began to seriously consider how he should get out. Given the current circumstances, if he stayed here, even if he could explain himself, he would likely face trouble later on. Therefore, the best solution was to slip out unnoticed. Thinking of this, Luke began to scan the entire dungeon. There were rows of polished trophies, as well as ceremonial items used by the school during festivals. In the corner, various odds and ends were piled up. Based on Luke's previous memory and his understanding of the school's situation, these items were likely contraband confiscated by Filch from other students. A piece of parchment tacked to the wall read, "Luke, surprised. Unexpected. I told you I'd make you pay." The writing quickly disappeared after Luke saw it. Luke curled his lip. The other party was quite cautious with these actions. He pulled out the note that had tricked him into coming here and found that the writing on that parchment had also completely vanished. Malfoy really did have some brains. However, when Luke peeled the slightly yellowed parchment tacked to the wall, its unique texture surprised him. He took the parchment down and slowly unfolded it. The strange quality of the parchment surprised him, and the way it was folded seemed somewhat unusual. Just as he was pondering why it felt familiar, Luke's eyes lit up. Could this be that thing? Luke's breathing quickened. Shouldn't this item be in the hands of the Weasley twins? Why was it here? Had Filch confiscated it again? Malfoy and his group had written on it, meaning they hadn't realized the item's extraordinary nature at all. Luke stared at the parchment, growing excited. If it really was that item, then this trip was definitely a huge payoff. Luke pulled out his acacia wood wand, gently tapped the parchment, and whispered, "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good." Following the fluctuation of Luke's magic. The next moment, the seemingly ordinary parchment automatically and slowly unfolded, transforming into an A3-sized map of Hogwarts. Information about various locations even began to appear around the edges. Most surprisingly, names began to float and move across the map. Luke could even see the names of Dumbledore and Fawkes the Phoenix on the 7th floor. What astonished him the most was that many people, including Draco Malfoy, Harry Potter, Hermione, and Professors McGonagall and Snape, were surging toward the dungeon. Seeing a large, dense area of names approaching his location, Luke understood. Good heavens! Draco Malfoy, that scoundrel, truly uses dirty tricks. Even if he hadn't done anything in the dungeon. By alarming so many professors and students, he wouldn't be able to explain himself when they arrived. However, the most important thing right now was how to leave the dungeon. Judging by the situation, the pathways on both sides were already occupied by students and professors. The names of Filch and his cat, Mrs. Norris, were clearly lying in wait at another fork, showing that the opponent was fully prepared and intended to catch him like a turtle in a jar. If Luke acted rashly, he would certainly be caught. And once trapped in the dungeon, even if Malfoy falsely accused him of things he hadn't done, Snape and Professor McGonagall would punish him in order to assert authority. Luke's gaze darted back and forth. However, the most crucial thing now was how to escape safely. He stared at the Marauder's map before him. Although acquiring this treasure was a huge gain, if he let Malfoy succeed, his mood would be far from pleasant. Just then, in Luke's mind, the magical Chef 2.0 system activated and projected itself before him. Ding! Detected special alchemical item, Marauder's map. Upgrade available. Does the host wish to proceed with the upgrade? The mechanical voice sounded once more. Luke was slightly surprised. He then said to the system, upgrade the Marauder's map. A strange, unseen light flashed, and the Marauder's map in his hand slowly dematerialized and vanished. Outside of the ethereal panel, a map resembling a light screen reappeared. Besides the content visible earlier, it could even display more detailed and three-dimensional information. Treating it as a last resort, Luke asked the system, what are the functions of the upgraded Marauder's map? The system hummed and displayed. The current upgraded Marauder's map can transform into a magical version of a high-precision navigation map, and simultaneously possesses the function of directional apparition within the map's range. The apparition function requires the host to utilize beacon magic. This means a magical mark must be placed at the corresponding location to enable the transfer. Luke was initially delighted, but then frowned. Beacon magic is not something easily learned. One usually wouldn't encounter this kind of magic until the 5th or 6th year. In his memory, aside from being used by Tom Riddle in the Chamber of Secrets, it appeared more often as the specific Death Eater mark, the so-called Mors Mordra. Yet, how could he learn such a thing instantly? Even with the system's emotional value boost, without the relevant spell and explanation of its underlying principles, he absolutely could not cast it. Just as Luke was growing anxious, he noticed a faint point of light brightening in the Hufflepuff common room. The name on the light point stunned him. Shyvana. Why was a light appearing here? Luke extended his wand, pointing slightly toward the light spot marked with Shyvana's name. Immediately, strange magic began to fluctuate. Congratulations, host, you have found a suitable extended beacon point. Do you wish to proceed with the transfer? Luke was taken aback. It could be used this way. Shyvana had saved him again. Perhaps due to the connection between the two of them, Shyvana actually carried the trace of beacon magic. Luke took a deep breath and cast his magic. His figure instantly blurred. In a flash, he returned to the Hufflepuff common room. Shyvana, who had been stealthily washing up, suddenly felt a chill down her back as a figure bumped into her. Shyvana's expression turned cold with anger. She hadn't expected that even after carefully checking that no one was around, someone still managed to approach secretly. At this moment, her only concern was her young master's safety. Shyvana was about to retaliate instantly, but she turned her head and saw it was Luke. She immediately hugged Luke in surprise, saying, "Young master, how did you come back? And I didn't sense anything at all." Luke motioned for Shyvana to be quiet, while he pondered the current situation. Right now, the Marauder's map showed that he was trapped like a turtle in a jar. He was sure Malfoy was utterly smug. For this pampered, arrogant fellow, Luke decided he needed to teach him a lesson. Draco Malfoy, is it? You're in for a surprise. Outside the dungeons. Malfoy, aren't you going a bit too far? Ron looked coldly at Draco Malfoy, and Harry stared intently at him too. Both Harry and Ron's expressions showed they were certain Draco was responsible for today's incident. Draco, however, still wore a smile, the corner of his mouth curved. I haven't done anything at all. Don't talk nonsense, or I'll sue you for slander. Hermione looked at Draco's expression and immediately felt angry, quietly scolding him. Maybe Luke isn't inside. To make such a fuss over a small matter, gathering so many people and even troubling a professor to come here, I think you did this on purpose. Malfoy gave a mocking smile. Stop struggling, all of you. Luke violated the rules and should be punished according to school regulations. If you obstruct this further, you will also be indirectly violating school regulations. My father is on the school board. Snape coldly turned his head to look at Draco and snapped, "Be quiet." Hermione was not annoyed. Instead, a thoughtful look appeared in her eyes. Luke was no ordinary young wizard. Given his abilities, even if he knew the Alohomora, it was impossible that he would simply be locked in here. Malfoy was probably overthinking things. How could a genius young wizard, who could perform transfiguration magic on the train and freely use the levitation charm on the boat, not see through Draco's scheme? But seeing Draco's confident appearance still caused a flicker of worry in Hermione. Under the gaze of many classmates and the professor, she could only pray silently. Draco Malfoy was secretly pleased. With that strong adhesive, even if Luke tried every trick in the book, he absolutely couldn't escape this iron door. Furthermore, Professor Snape and Filch were already stationed nearby. As soon as the door opened, Luke definitely wouldn't escape. Seeing Malfoy's smug look, Harry and Ron were grinding their teeth. This guy had definitely done this on purpose, otherwise why would he have that expression? Professor, open the door quickly. Once the door is open, the whole truth will be revealed. Although Draco had been reprimanded by Snape, in his own view, Professor Snape was merely protecting him. Snape waved his wand and quietly commanded, Alohomora. A pale blue light shot out, and the iron lock made a creak sound. Then, under the nervous gaze of Harry and the others, the door did not open. Everyone was immediately surprised. Snape looked at the keyhole, a thoughtful expression on his face. Hominum revelio. His spell revealed a layer of transparent but extremely sturdy strong adhesive covering the keyhole and the door seams. Snape turned his head to look at Malfoy standing nearby. Malfoy was basking in his triumph, failing to notice the change in Snape's expression. Snape grew impatient and waved his hand. A sharp cutting strike instantly slashed toward the door, and the iron lock was defindo. He didn't even utter a spell during the entire process. Snape pushed the door open with a crash. Malfoy, seeing the expressions of fear and worry on Harry and Ron's faces, felt completely satisfied and burst into laughter. Harry, I told you, your judgment in friends isn't very good. This Luke is reaping what he sowed. It's no surprise he was caught by the professor now. Ron clenched his teeth, wishing he could punch Malfoy's foul mouth twice, but he could only follow him into the dungeons now. The dungeons were spacious, dark, and damp, but otherwise normal. Professor Snape and Professor McGonagall scanned the room, and Draco's previous smugness froze. His face turned pale. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were pushed inside by the remaining young wizards. The others stood at the doorway, seemingly suppressed by Snape's lingering authority, daring not to move forward. Harry and Ron immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Hermione, meanwhile, wore an "I knew it" expression. Even if Luke had been to the dungeons, and even if the lock had been tampered with, there was absolutely no way Malfoy could simply catch Luke. Just as everyone was relaxing, Severus Snape's icy voice squeezed out from between his teeth, sounding exactly like a giant bat. Draco Malfoy, didn't you say Luke was violating the rules, causing massive destruction, and stealing things in the dungeons? Now tell me, where is he? Now the pressure was entirely on Malfoy. His eyes revealed disbelief, and at the same time, he turned to look at Goyle and Crabbe, who were pressed against the doorway. Both wore expressions of fear. They frantically wanted to prove that they had genuinely followed Draco's instructions. Luke was clearly supposed to be locked in the dungeons, but his presence was nowhere to be seen now. They truly had no idea Malfoy felt a chill run down his spine as he looked at his dean's face, dark as water. This was bad. If he couldn't provide a reasonable explanation today, Professor Snape would probably explode right then and there. Draco's eyes shifted, unable to conceal his panic. He said, somewhat tremulously. Dean, could it be that Luke used some sort of invisibility method? Snape immediately let out a cold snort. Draco, watch your words. What would a mere first-year student use to turn invisible? Whether it's an invisibility potion or other means of concealment, could you, the young master of the House of Malfoy, manage it? With every question asked, Draco's face grew paler. Professor McGonagall, standing nearby, also looked at Draco with a stern gaze. She had originally thought Luke had done something terrible and wondered if she could use this chance to get Luke's studies back on track. Unexpectedly, instead of finding Luke, she witnessed a farce created by Draco. She did not wish to comment on the Slytherin students. After all, Snape was her former student and current colleague. Furthermore, Snape was Dumbledore's most reliable and trusted subordinate. And Snape was currently the Dean of Slytherin. He should still be given the appropriate respect. Snape was thoroughly enraged at this moment. Draco Malfoy, that idiot, needed to at least frame someone accurately. He had also heard the name of that young wizard called Luke. Clearly, the other party was not so easily framed. Snape's wand pointed around the surroundings. Reveal yourselves. Harry and the others' hearts skipped a beat. So suddenly. Luke wasn't really still hiding here, was he? However, as the wand waved, nothing seemed to happen in the surroundings. The wand in Snape's hand spun again, and a strong current of air swirled throughout the dungeons. There was still no abnormality. Snape turned and looked coldly at Malfoy. This is what you call someone hiding here. What else do you have to say? Snape was very angry. After all, the door sealed shut with strong adhesive was evidence enough. Draco was indeed lacking the proper discipline he deserved. And what angered him the most was that he had followed them here before finishing the potion he was brewing for Dumbledore. This idiot Draco showed him this. Also Harry's eyes, and Harry's sour face. To be honest, his mood was quite irritable right now. Malfoy's face had completely lost its color. This was a classic case of failing to frame someone and getting framed instead. He had previously boasted that if he couldn't catch Luke, he would take the punishment himself. Now, he was truly starting to panic. Dean, I was wrong. I don't know how things turned out this way. Luke clearly. Snape snorted coldly. 10 points from Slytherin. Draco Malfoy is required to clean the potion class and transfiguration class classrooms for 1 week. It was precisely at this moment. Luke arrived belatedly. He squeezed out from behind the crowd. Everyone finally saw the main person, and a sudden uproar ensued. Luke, why are you here? Everyone looked back at the dungeons, wearing expressions of anticipation for a good show. Good heavens, everyone was blocking the entrance of the dungeons to catch Luke, yet Luke had brazenly walked out from behind them. This kid has some tricks up his sleeve. The Weasley twins in the distance even showed a hint of respect in their eyes. Joy overflowed from Harry, Ron, and Hermione. They had originally imagined that if Luke were truly caught, they would have to help him shoulder some of the blame no matter what. They never expected this. Not only was Luke fine, but he had also emerged from behind the crowd, turning the tables on his accusers. Malfoy was probably going to faint from anger now. Among the group, Ron's gaze was the most resolute. In his mind, Luke must have been framed by Malfoy. But Luke must have used some method to quietly leave the area. He looked at Luke with admiration, unaware that he was the one closest to the truth among the three. Malfoy's expression was utterly hideous. Luke, how could you? How were you able to walk out of there? You must have used some kind of trick or scheme to escape, right? Upon saying this, Draco Malfoy immediately shut his mouth. However, his face grew even uglier. In his panic just now, he had nearly blurted out the truth about his framing attempt. Luke chuckled, turning to look at Professor McGonagall and Professor Snape, and said, Professors, I never expected to be sitting at home only to have trouble fall from the sky. I believe everything is perfectly clear now, isn't it? I was shocked when I heard Malfoy framed me, and I was even more surprised to hear that, judging by his words, this was premeditated. For a situation like this, is cleaning classrooms and deducting 10 points sufficient? I seem to have gained a deeper understanding of the school rules. Luke's words were undoubtedly like knives, indiscriminately attacking both Draco and Snape. Snape stared coldly at Luke. Seeing the professor's gloomy expression, Luke automatically filtered it out. He was just a Professor Snape who was tough on the outside and soft on the inside. He wasn't afraid, he pitied him. Draco's methods were indeed contemptible, and failure to punish him would not quell Luke's anger. Professor Snape, huh? As long as he took things seriously, he could still earn the professor's appreciation. Seeing the complete lack of fear in Luke's eyes, Ron and Harry watched from the side, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. Professor McGonagall, seeing Luke's expression, turned and spoke to Snape. Severus, I also feel that the punishment for Malfoy seems genuinely too light. Snape's face twitched immediately, and he withdrew his death glare. Draco Malfoy is to clean the public restrooms for 1 week, and Slytherin will be deducted another 20 points. Having said this, Snape turned into a gust of wind and hurried away without looking back. However, the look he gave the young wizards was not so friendly. Harry and Ron, hearing that Draco's punishment was further increased, and that Slytherin had lost a total of 30 points due to Draco's actions, with the punishment personally handed down by Dean Snape, could barely contain the smiles overflowing on their faces, and their eyes were sparkling. Professor McGonagall looked at the group, instantly becoming speechless. You lot, you certainly love a spectacle, don't you? Mr. Harry Potter, Mr. Ron Weasley, and Miss Granger, each of you will lose 1 point for Gryffindor. In the next Transfiguration class, I will ask questions in class. If you cannot answer them, Gryffindor will continue to lose points. I hope you still have the leisure to wander around and smile. Professor McGonagall's words were undoubtedly a depth charge for the young wizards. As her gaze swept over them, the gawking young wizards outside the dungeons immediately scattered like birds and beasts. Good heavens, if they got caught, they would truly have nowhere to cry. Not only would they have house points deducted by a professor, and face the scrutiny of the other young wizards, merely being called upon in class and stared at with a death glare while being questioned was enough to make them sweat buckets. They did not have the courage of the Golden Trio, nor did they have the backing of Draco Malfoy. Professor McGonagall's gaze finally turned to Luke. Mr. Graves, although this matter seems to have nothing to do with you, I heard from other young wizards that you have been running a private stall at school. Is this true? Luke immediately felt awkward, but before he could explain, Professor McGonagall continued. Passion is a good thing, but I hope you can have more possibilities during your time at school. This will bring about significant changes in your life, and you are still young, Mr. Graves. I hope a young wizard can enjoy a relaxed and happy youth. Hogwarts is truly beautiful. Of course, if you insist on it, you need to be able to back it up with sufficient confidence. In Transfiguration class, I hope you can give me a satisfactory answer. Everyone, disperse. Professor McGonagall waved her hand, and her dark green wizard robe rustled as she departed. Ron's eyes were sparkling. Luke, what exactly did you agree to? You're not going to use Transfiguration to demonstrate breaking stones on your chest, are you? Professor McGonagall left the dungeons. But her mind was a jumble of thoughts. Luke was a good child in every way, except for his overly deep obsession with cooking. Since he had entered the wizarding world, he should prioritize learning magic. Once he completed the 7 years of curriculum at school, no one would stop him from doing whatever he wished. But losing the golden age of learning might cause a gifted young wizard like Luke to completely fade into obscurity. Whether it was Luke's talent and patience, or the aptitude he displayed in wand selection and transfiguration, Professor McGonagall did not want Luke to give up on himself. That's why Professor McGonagall adopted this method, hoping to dissuade Luke from his ideas. Hogwarts Castle, 7th floor. The walls were covered with picture frames, and within the portraits, people conversed with each other, while some figures would suddenly disappear. In one frame, several wizards were huddled together, seemingly studying some secret. Behind the large long table, Dumbledore, who had been perusing magic books, suddenly adjusted his glasses. He was a little surprised. Just now, an inexplicable magical fluctuation appeared simultaneously in 2 places in the school. The feeling seemed like the power of apparition, yet it was completely different. Dumbledore's perception extended almost throughout the entire academy, and at this moment, a hint of interest arose in his heart. Although this magical fluctuation was not strong enough, the trace of this magical fluctuation seemed somewhat similar to a certain newly enrolled young wizard. Dumbledore immediately showed a smile. Luke, how interesting. Previously, McGonagall had reported to him that Luke was exceptionally outstanding in his wand selection and transfiguration talent. He hadn't expected another pleasant surprise just a few days later. Perhaps more attention could be invested in Luke. As for Mr. Potter, he seemed to have grown somewhat accustomed to life in Gryffindor at Hogwarts, and at this moment, appeared a bit idle. But that's all right, everyone needs a period of growth when they enter school. Under the guidance of the various professors, he believed Harry Potter would have astonishing growth. And his trials should also be put on the agenda. In the dungeons, Draco Malfoy's face had turned from pale to flushed, and then from flushed to livid. It could be said that his expression was wonderfully captivating. Although the professor's punishment had already been carried out, seeing the expressions of those around him, Malfoy felt as if everyone was mocking him. As the young master of the House of Malfoy, he found such humiliation simply unacceptable. Ron, who was beside him, finally couldn't help but burst out laughing after Professor McGonagall and the others left. Harry, though trying hard to hold it in, couldn't suppress the upward curve of his lips. Hermione didn't laugh out loud, but her expression also showed great satisfaction. At this moment, Draco blamed everything on Luke. If it weren't for Luke, how could he be like this? Luke, I'll remember you. Malfoy's expression immediately brought a smile to Luke's face. This is just a small punishment. Next time, remember not to use such despicable methods and tricks. And remember what I said, you seemed to have said that last time, didn't you? Draco's face turned crimson again, almost gasping for breath in anger. I challenge you to a duel. Luke immediately smiled. A duel? Are you sure? Draco said fiercely. Since we've both just started school, don't say I'm not giving you a chance to bully you. In a month, I'll make you beg for mercy fair and square. Don't chicken out then. Malfoy then turned and left. Goyle and Crabbe, who were nearby, were somewhat uncomfortable and quickly followed Draco's footsteps. Boss, what should we do now? The upperclassmen and upper-class women in our Slytherin house don't seem to be looking at us very kindly. Goyle asked anxiously. Draco immediately became furious. It's all your fault, you two. Do you still have the nerve to talk? If it weren't for you two not even being able to handle such a trivial matter, how would I have received such a severe punishment? Goyle was immediately scolded into lowering his head but still looked expectantly at Draco. Boss, what are you going to do about cleaning the classrooms and toilets? Professor Snape's words absolutely cannot be questioned. Draco's face darkened again, and he angrily kicked Goyle in the backside, roaring. Why bring up something that's already a sore point, huh? Will you die if you don't speak? Filch, who emerged from the corner cradling Mrs. Norris, looked disappointed. What about the promised punishment for bad students? He had been hiding in the corner, his back almost breaking, but no one came. For Draco Malfoy, Luke's victory was Harry and Ron's victory. Seeing Malfoy slink away at this moment, both of them felt as if they had eaten honey. After all, Malfoy was truly too annoying. Such an outcome was simply immensely satisfying. Ron immediately gave Luke 100 thumbs up in his heart. He even asked, "How did you escape?" Luke smiled mysteriously. Ron seemed to realize he had spoken out of turn and immediately covered his mouth, giving a knowing look. Hermione finally breathed a sigh of relief seeing Luke unharmed, but then her expression became somewhat tense. You two still have the nerve to fool around here. While it's truly delightful that Luke is all right, didn't you hear just now? Professor McGonagall's transfiguration class next period won't be so easy to pass. Are you two really not worried at all? Ron said somewhat indifferently from the side. It hasn't started yet anyway. Professor McGonagall surely won't ask anything outrageous, will she? Harry, beside him, hesitated slightly. I'll seriously look through the book in the afternoon. Hermione immediately stamped her foot. Haven't you two looked at the timetable? Our afternoon classes are all full. The first class is Professor McGonagall's transfiguration class. If you wait until the afternoon to read the book, everything will be cold. Since Professor McGonagall mentioned it in advance, it means she will definitely ask some questions. If you two don't prepare, you're dead. Then she turned to Luke. Although I don't know what agreement you have with Professor McGonagall, judging by Professor McGonagall's expression, you probably won't have such an easy time passing the next Transfiguration class, which Gryffindor and Hufflepuff will attend together. Luke nodded, expressing his thanks to Hermione. Hermione looked a little shy. Of course, it might just be me overthinking. After all, you are completely different from those two. With your talent and learning speed, Professor McGonagall's questions shouldn't stump you. At most, Professor McGonagall will only ask you some simple transfiguration spells, which will be no problem for you at all. Luke immediately showed a mysterious smile from the side. At this moment, if he told Hermione about his agreement with Professor McGonagall, Hermione probably wouldn't be so calm. After all, that was an entire volume of a compendium of basic spells. Ron, hearing Hermione's words, immediately frowned. Then he plucked up his courage and said, "Don't worry, Harry and I will go learn right now. This afternoon, we two will definitely amaze everyone. Luke, don't you worry either. If you encounter something you don't know, just ask me. Good brothers in heart." Saying that, Ron patted his chest. Watching Ron's confident appearance, Luke felt somewhat like laughing. When did this guy become so inexplicably confident? However, Luke indicated that he would still accept Ron's good intentions. Thus, Ron left with an expression that said, "I've got your back," while Luke opened his own panel. The system panel popped up. Host: Luke Graves. Cooking skill: Cooking level, SS. Magic power level, E. Charms level, D. Transfiguration level, D. Potion level, A-. Cooking bonus. Alchemy level, D. Blacksmith bonus. Defense level, E. Cooking bonus. White magic level, F. Dark arts level, C. Cooking bonus. Special skill: Upgraded Marauder's Map. Current long-term uncompleted tasks. Task 1. Path to Godhood. 5 jobs a day, the cooking god stays relaxed. Progress 99.3, 100 reward. A set of legendary cooking utensils. Task 2. Night Owl God of War. Continuously selling late-night snacks at Hogwarts for 1 academic year grants a 100% replication ability of 1 sacred artifact repeatable. Task 3. Having a retinue. Handmaiden Night Order current members activated, 1/200th reward. 1x magic power bonus. Task 4. Dragon Guard. Help Shyvana enhance the extremely thin ancient ice and fire dragon bloodline within her body. Reward: dual animagus form. Looking at the 4 long-term tasks that remained incomplete, Luke felt that the road ahead was long and arduous. Besides these 4 tasks issued by the system, Luke also decided to learn the extension charm and even find an opportunity to obtain the vanishing cabinet at Borgin and Burke's. Furthermore, because of Malfoy, he unexpectedly obtained and upgraded the Marauder's Map. Therefore, Luke also maintained an intense interest in beacon magic. Throughout all of Hogwarts, except for Dumbledore and the Phoenix Fox, no one could freely traverse using apparition. Once he completely covered every corner of Hogwarts with beacons, then he could truly go wherever he wanted. If this divine artifact was utilized well, its effect at Hogwarts would be even more useful than the invisibility cloak Dumbledore later gave to Harry. Luke took a deep breath, his schedule was packed to the brim. However, besides these matters, one thing was urgent: to escape the dungeons early. He had used a large amount of emotional value to upgrade the Marauder's Map. This resulted in the emotional value he had saved to learn a compendium of basic spells being almost entirely depleted. Looking at the hourglass on the system panel that materialized his magic emotional value, which was nearly empty, Luke gave a wry smile. He still had to keep grinding. Fortunately, the system itself provided him with a boost. Even if he only managed a quick nap during the 24 hours of the day, he could remain energetic throughout. Without this special physique, he would have long since burnt out. The afternoon transfiguration class was shared between Gryffindor and Hufflepuff. Luke had to harvest enough emotional value before noon ended so that he could learn the first volume of a compendium of basic spells. Therefore, he needed to seize every second right now. Ideally, while gaining permission to set up his stall from Professor McGonagall, he should also get authorization to view books related to beacon magic and dragons. And Professor McGonagall was notoriously strict regarding studies. Unless he could gain her approval, how could he possibly access books outside the scope of their curriculum? Perhaps he needed to do something big all at once. The incident in the dungeons had spread like wildfire. In just one morning, everyone had heard about it. And Luke's brilliant maneuver couldn't help but become a topic of discussion among many young wizards. Malfoy instantly became a negative example. Luke's unique methods, however, piqued everyone's curiosity. After all, people believed that even if Malfoy was foolish, he wouldn't do something completely inexplicable. Luke must have been one step ahead, completely crushing Malfoy's scheme. Speaking of which, those guys from Slytherin were all arrogant and calculating. It was rare for them to suffer a setback. What Luke did was absolutely satisfying. Apart from a few young wizards from the Snake House who had slight reservations, the other three houses unanimously applauded Luke's actions. And Luke arrived fashionably late at this moment. Seeing many young wizards sitting by the long tables waiting for lunch to begin. Ignoring the glances occasionally cast his way, he walked straight to the Hufflepuff long table. They saw the alchemy grimoire in his hand rapidly expand, and then a massive stone pot appeared before everyone. This scene surprised many young wizards. What was Luke trying to do? A giant stone pot that 4 or 5 people couldn't even wrap their arms around. What was going on? Luke, however, continued to place ingredients into the pot, minding his own business. The numerous young wizards exchanged bewildered glances. What was Luke going to do? He actually dared to openly cook in the Hogwarts Great Hall. Although it was rumored that the food Luke cooked was incredibly fragrant. But after the events of the morning, did he still dare to do this? Was he challenging Professor McGonagall's authority? Everyone's eyes were filled with doubt. Luke's smooth, flowing operation immediately drew many young wizards to watch. His wand continuously waved. Basic movement charms were used effortlessly, applying them to cooking was simply genius. It left the young wizards stunned. Some young wizards from wizarding families felt dazed upon seeing this kind of magic, which even their elders at home couldn't use proficiently. Meanwhile, the stone pot bibimbap Luke was making was now completely covered with a lid. Blazing fire. Incendio. The wand made of acacia wood released flames beneath the massive stone pot. The newly admitted young wizards widened their eyes. Charms class hadn't even truly begun yet. Had Luke's magic level already reached this extent? As the flames continuously surged, sweat started to bead on Luke's forehead. Although he had mastered several practical spells driven by the magic emotional value, his magic power level was truly too poor, and he was barely holding on. After only persisting for such a short time, his magic power was already nearly depleted. But thinking about having to deal with Professor McGonagall's class later, Luke gritted his teeth and continued the operation. As the flames continuously heated the pot, the rich aroma carried by the heat waves was fully released, and the marvelous scent was simply mesmerizing. Luke waved the wand in his hand. Chunks of meat emitting a rich fragrance, emerald green vegetables, and tempting crimson sauce were all dropped into the pot. As the black powder from the crystal bottle in Luke's hand was poured in, he quickly placed the lid on the pot. An even richer, peculiar fragrance completely spread out. Gurgled Tilda. What kind of magic is this, exactly? It's just a meal, how can it smell this good? Hey, who is that? Don't steal my napkin, I drooled into the pumpkin juice. The young wizards erupted in an uproar. With this soul-stirring aroma, no one could remain seated. The numerous young wizards rushed over to surround him. Luke, when do we eat? I feel like I could eat an entire pig in 3 bites. The young wizards proved Luke's strength with their actions. As the enticing aroma grew stronger, everyone's eyes were fixed on the large, flame-blossoming pot. Just as Malfoy and his companions entered the Great Hall, they exchanged glances. Goyle's eyes were filled with an impulse for delicious food. What is this smell? Why is it so fragrant? Boss, my stomach is rumbling, I can't stop it. Although Malfoy wanted to reprimand them, his own stomach also began to rumble incooperatively. This aroma was simply unheard of, making him involuntarily recall the steamed buns from that morning. A scene suddenly flashed in Malfoy's mind. Could Luke be audaciously courting death? If he really dared to sell lunch in broad daylight like this, then he wouldn't be falsely reporting a military situation, and perhaps he could receive some forgiveness from Professor Snape. After all, cleaning toilets was too embarrassing to talk about. Thinking of this, Malfoy rushed in and saw Luke surrounded by 3 layers of people. And when he pushed through the crowd and saw Luke diligently preparing ingredients, a smile immediately appeared on his face, and the corners of his mouth turned up. Luke, you really never change. I admit you have some skill, but you dare to openly violate the rules set by Professor McGonagall. I'd like to see how you'll manage Transfiguration class this afternoon. Seeing Malfoy's frantic provocation, Luke, however, didn't care at all. This child apparently still didn't quite understand his punishment. At this moment, Luke waved his hand slightly, pointing at Draco Malfoy and saying, "Although this stone pot bibimbap I make only costs 1 canute per person, out of respect for the chef, I will refuse unhygienic people. Mr. Draco Malfoy, you were just punished by Professor Snape to clean the toilets. If you haven't showered, I suggest you don't come closer, lest you contaminate the taste." Draco's face instantly flushed red. What did you say? He had calculated everything, but he never expected Luke to attack him from this angle. From the moment he received the punishment until now, he hadn't had time to clean the toilets. Moreover, how could he possibly do such a thing himself? If it had to be done, he would definitely have Crabbe and Goyle help. However, the morning's events had already spread, and now that Luke had made such a declaration, the many young wizards immediately made a huge space for him with some disdain. At this moment, Malfoy only felt his face sting. The gazes of everyone around him were like slaps, making his face crimson. In the stone pot, the aroma grew increasingly rich. Draco suppressed the rebellious cravings in his stomach, glared at Luke hatefully, and snorted. "I'd like to see how you're going to get out of this." This scene was witnessed by Hermione, who had just returned from studying. Hermione was a bit anxious. Why was Luke so unyielding and so bold? Although the food Luke made was incredibly delicious, Professor McGonagall had repeatedly warned against this. This afternoon was Professor McGonagall's class. Luke, wasn't he just walking into a trap? Why don't you stop? Before the professor finds out. Hermione stealthily moved next to Luke and patiently tried to persuade him. While I know you're very dedicated to cooking, if Professor McGonagall gets angry this afternoon, you'll be in a lot of trouble. Luke nodded and smiled at Hermione. The lid of the huge stone pot was opened, and a rich aroma spread out. Besides the glistening rice grains, the stone pot bibimbap naturally featured the perfect ratio of meat and vegetables, along with rich sauce and magical seasoning powder that Luke had acquired at great expense, making the taste of this stone pot bibimbap simply beyond imagination. Luke's hands flew up and down, and the next moment, a tempting plate of stone pot bibimbap was presented before Hermione's eyes. Hermione was stunned for a moment, and then her stomach grumbled incooperatively. Luke smiled. "It's 1 canute. Eat it while it's hot." Hermione's cheeks immediately puffed out in anger, just like a squirrel. However, although she was a bit annoyed, there was no reason not to eat the delicious food right in front of her. Hermione stomped her foot and left with the plate. However, Luke's actions were like a zookeeper tapping an iron basin to signal, and the young wizards swarmed forward. "Give me a portion. I want a portion too." The young wizards, who were already famished and disoriented, didn't care about Luke's future consequences and frantically snatched the food. Malfoy in the distance was neither strong nor weak. Goyle, looking excited, squeezed out of the crowd, carrying 2 large plates of stone pot bibimbap, his eyes gleaming. Draco's eyes couldn't help but linger, but he still spoke stubbornly. "I would rather die than eat anything Luke makes." Goyle, beside him, nodded vigorously. "Boss, you're right, Luke is our enemy." Goyle buried his head directly into the plate and devoured the food. So delicious. Draco was so angry he felt like he was fuming, but the hunger in his stomach made him I couldn't help but want to reach for the other plate of stone pot bibimbap. His palm lightly pressed on the plate, an internal struggle raging within him. Draco's gaze was burning, hoping Goyle would be sensible. Goyle, who had finished 1 plate, looked up at Draco. "Boss, what are you doing?" Draco's expression immediately stiffened, and the movement of his hand stopped. Goyle asked, moved, "Boss, are you afraid I won't have enough to eat, right?" "Don't worry, 2 plates should get me about 6 or 7/10 full." Saying this, he took the plate and continued to devour the food. Draco's face was expressionless, looking at the pumpkin juice and steak that appeared out of thin air on the table, his eyes somewhat hollow. Meanwhile, Harry and Ron were in the Transfiguration classroom. Ron's eyes were filled with determination and persistence as he looked at Harry. We can definitely do it, right? Harry hesitated a little but still nodded. This was Professor McGonagall's first Transfiguration class. If they still couldn't answer any questions after Professor McGonagall's reminders, then they would truly make a spectacle of themselves. Even if Professor McGonagall was the Dean of Gryffindor, she wouldn't be lenient with them in the slightest. Ron flipped through the pages, grimacing as he said to Harry. Why is this stuff so difficult? Where do I even look? Harry adjusted his glasses slightly. Hermione has already highlighted the key points. Since we are beginners, the questions Professor McGonagall asks probably won't be too difficult, as long as we understand some basic rules and the general framework of Transfiguration. Ron's brows relaxed slightly, then he regained his fighting spirit. Yeah, we both need to study hard. Although Luke is smart, he doesn't seem to have any intention of reviewing. Moreover, the morning's events will still affect Luke, right? If both of us can not only answer Professor McGonagall's questions in class but also help Luke, wouldn't we have gained a little face? Harry hesitated and did not answer, merely burying his head in his books, though he thought to himself. Can I really help Luke? Ron mumbled as he read his book. Touching his stomach, he pulled out 2 licorice wands from his pocket and said to Harry. Just chew on these for now. I really miss Luke's cooking. As long as we can help Luke, he definitely won't be able to refuse making a special meal just for us. Just the 2 of us, haha, just thinking about it makes me excited. Harry's spirits lifted. That's right, to get unique food from Luke, one naturally needs to put in some effort. And the price was their last-minute cramming at noon. Ron cheered wildly beside him. Only the 2 of us will eat, no one else will get any, ha 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 ha. Ron furiously flipped through his Transfiguration textbook, as if the most delicious thing was hidden within it. However, the portrait of the Transfiguration Great Master next to him, who had been yawning and napping, suddenly seemed to be startled awake. Figures approached at high speed, then quickly disappeared. Each of them was in a hurry. Ron glanced at them, a little curious. But the knowledge in the textbook before him was simply too profound, already suppressing his vigorous thirst for knowledge. In the Great Hall, after seeing that almost all the young wizards of Hogwarts had been gathered, Luke finally let out a slight sigh of relief. Fortunately, the stone pot he had prepared was large enough. Even if these young wizards ate a lot, it would be more than enough. He just hadn't expected the powdered seasoning made from magic plants to be so potent, elevating the deliciousness of the food by a whole rank. Indeed, studying magic was the right choice. Luke glanced at the temporarily empty staff area in the distance. He very conscientiously placed plate after plate of golden dishes filled with stone pot bibimbap. Stone pot bibimbap with rich meat, verdant vegetables, and rice grains carrying the aroma of sauce and flame were placed in front of each seat in the staff area. As for Dumbledore, Luke even thoughtfully prepared a cup of lemon honey water. However, he had still improved the lemon honey water, adding the same powder to it. Human relations must be handled. Otherwise, the commotion he caused today would be too great for him to handle alone. I hope the delicious food can somewhat appease the professor's anger. Sure enough, just as Luke expected. As the professors entered the staff dining room, their steps almost simultaneously froze in front of their seats. Smelling the stone pot bibimbap, whose aroma was distinctly different from the steaks and pumpkin pies next to it. Then, seeing the young wizards slurping and devouring their food, each of them seemed possessed, wildly stuffing their mouths, and several of them immediately looked at each other in dismay. Finally, they saw Luke diligently serving the stone pot bibimbap in front of the huge stone pot. It's him again. Snape's sharp gaze instantly caught Luke's movements, but the aroma coming from his nostrils made him somewhat surprised. This never-before-seen delicacy seemed to possess a special magic. The room was silent. Snape, usually extremely strict, uncharacteristically was the first to sit down, pick up a spoon, and gently take a bite. The rich aroma instantly filled his entire mouth. And what was most surprising was that, under Luke's almost great master-level culinary skills, he actually felt a slight healing of his body's fatigue. This is the power to soothe the soul. Snape was a little surprised and took another bite. Meanwhile, Professor McGonagall, upon seeing Luke's actions, felt her blood pressure surge. Luke was good in every way, except for his stubbornness in cooking. Although she probably, perhaps, understood this feeling. Only when a person has dedication in their domain can they achieve remarkable results. Just as she had a special fondness for transfiguration, and had long ago reached the acknowledged peak of the transfiguration domain, animagus, many years ago. She even formed her own unique theoretical system. And Luke, in the Muggle world, was essentially the same, even already having a great reputation. Thinking of this, she couldn't help but sigh slightly. Since this child had experienced so much, why didn't he understand her good intentions? Perhaps, this was the will of Merlin, in the unseen. She turned her head and saw that Snape, who was usually the most strict, was actually eating Luke's delicious food, spoon by spoon. Professor McGonagall was suspicious, and immediately sat down to taste it. The next moment, all her previous negative emotions were almost completely dispelled, and she was completely immersed in savoring the delicious food. Oh, what delicious food! Perhaps, what Luke was doing wasn't necessarily wrong. Professor McGonagall rarely felt a hint of hesitation. But the next moment, she sat up straight. No. Even so, Luke must diligently complete his studies. Professor Sprout in the distance, after tasting a bite of Luke's stone pot bibimbap, was immediately amazed. Oh, what a wonderful taste. It can be said that the combination of flavors is simply perfect. Pomona Sprout, who had always considered herself knowledgeable in both herbology and cooking, expressed such emotion for the first time. She scooped another bite and savored it slightly. Her eyes lifted, and her gaze intently fixed on Snape, who was eating with his head down. Severus, did you notice? Snape looked up at Pomona Sprout. Professor Sprout, if I'm not mistaken, this is a specially roasted medicinal powder, the main ingredient being mandrake powder. Sprout nodded slightly. That's right, it is indeed mandrake powder. Although its original shape is completely gone, its subtle characteristics are still very obvious. But what I'm confused about is. Snape continued Sprout's words. How did he manage to roast mandrake, which cures petrificus totalis, into a potion that soothes the mind and nourishes the soul? With all due respect, this thing already has a bit of high-rank potion technique. Sprout nodded repeatedly in agreement. And Professor McGonagall, upon hearing Snape's words, was also stunned. Snape was, aside from Dumbledore, the youngest acknowledged potions master in Britain, and Sprout's level in herbology goes without saying. It was unexpected that Luke, who had a talent for transfiguration, might also possess such an exaggerated talent in potions and herbal applications. The disappearing figures in the picture frames of the Transfiguration classroom were not the only ones. As everyone savored the delicious food, the figures in the picture frames throughout Hogwarts had almost all poured out. For the living beings that can move in picture frames, there are generally two situations. The first kind is simply made through a magic camera or magic drawing. Although they can move, it only stays on the surface. They will only move for a few seconds at most, and it's like a video repeating. Although it looks extremely magical, there isn't much mystery to it in essence. However, the other kind is completely different. Most of the portraits on the walls of Hogwarts, after being made, were imbued by the creator with the subject's thoughts, emotions, magic, and even a wisp of a soul imprint. That's why they can be preserved for a long time, and even possess a bit of the ability to think. And the more outstanding the ability, the stronger the magic of the person, the more so. This also makes it easy to explain why the portraits of successive principals and other famous figures in Dumbledore's office can communicate with Dumbledore, and even visit, or act as spies. Only at this moment, no one could resist the aroma of the stone pot bibimbap made by Luke. Ever since the figures in the portraits in the Great Hall smelled this peculiar aroma and felt their soul imprints become more stable, this matter spread like wildfire. The few large picture frames in the Great Hall were now almost packed with figures. And many figures were sniffing the unique aroma in the air with intoxicated expressions. Don't push, move aside and let me see what's going on. Black. You have no martial virtue. The figures in the picture frames pushed and shoved within the frames, behaving improperly. And this scene caused the young wizards and professors to look up one after another. Seeing the densely packed figures in the picture frames, everyone just felt if their eyes were broken. However, the young wizards were more surprised than the last. Isn't that the author of 7 Methods of Dragon Taming? And that person, I saw a celebrity from the Gryffindor era. Look, the fat lady was also squeezed out of the picture frame. And someone pointed at Principal Black and shouted. When it comes to dominance, it has to be this Hogwarts principal from the House of Black, who can squeeze past him. Such a miraculous scene, a spectacle of living portraits, made everyone gasp in amazement. Snape, however, perceived a deeper meaning within it. The potion Luke brewed with mandrake had such a strong effect, merely its scent was enough to drive the soul imprints in these portraits into a frenzy. It was at this moment that the entire Hogwarts truly resembled a stirred hornet's nest. Sir Nicholas. Yes, that nearly headless Nick, whose head was almost chopped off. And Lady Helena, the daughter of Ravenclaw's founder. The Bloody Baron, countless soul entities residing within Hogwarts emerged one by one from their original corners, greedily inhaling the fragrance in the air. Accustomed to year-round chill, they now felt a rare moment of warmth. Helena and the others even bowed in unison, paying their respects to Luke. After all, although the soul power contained in this hint of fragrance was not abundant, it brought them immense satisfaction. Rarely seen, even Peeves put aside his usual boisterousness and bowed to Luke from afar. If he remembered correctly, besides the Weasley twins, who were exceptionally gifted in mischief, Peeves rarely showed respect to other young wizards. It was precisely because of the bizarre changes around him that Dumbledore was alerted. He, who was originally in the headmaster's office, paused for a moment. Seeing the now empty wall of photo frames, a faint magical light bloomed in Dumbledore's hand. Immediately, images flowed before his eyes. The Great Hall was observed by him, and the commotion caused by Luke naturally surprised Dumbledore. This child, what a wonderful combination of magic, what amazing culinary ability, it is indeed somewhat surprising. However, the surprises for him seemed to be more than just these. The Sorting Hat, which had been placed back in the glass cabinet, spoke up unusually at this moment. Old Dumbledore, I seem to have sensed an inexplicable magical fluctuation, which is exactly what I need. Hurry and let me out. Dumbledore looked hesitantly at the Sorting Hat beside him, having not seen the Sorting Hat so active in a long time. It seemed that ever since Luke was sorted, the Sorting Hat had undergone a peculiar change. However, the Sorting Hat, whose wisdom had grown, would constantly clamor to get out. Dumbledore hesitated for a moment, softly offered a few words of comfort, and prepared to leave. However, the Sorting Hat suddenly forcibly shimmered with a ray of light, and then disappeared from the glass cabinet. Dumbledore's steps froze for a moment. Few things could shock him, even Tom sneaking into the school was not enough to surprise him. However, today's Sorting Hat truly made him feel a hint of astonishment. When did the Sorting Hat acquire such power? Although being able to draw out the Gryffindor sword proved that the Sorting Hat itself possessed spatial attributes, the fact that the Sorting Hat could use spatial magic on its own forced him to re-examine it. Luke really is a little fellow full of surprises. Dumbledore stretched, and slowly walked out of the headmaster's office. He wanted to see what the Sorting Hat intended to do. And the departed Sorting Hat, as expected, reappeared on Luke's head, immediately starting to babble. Hey, bro. Surprised, aren't you? Didn't we agree that you'd just let me know if you had this magical emotion? Now you're hogging it all by yourself. Fortunately, I, the Great Sorting Hat, sensed that peculiar magical fluctuation. Luke looked at the Sorting Hat already on his head with some embarrassment. He was already conspicuous enough, but because of the Sorting Hat, almost all the teachers and students in the school were now looking at him. Luke wanted to take off the hat. However, the Sorting Hat shimmered with a faint silver light and muttered. Don't. Please don't stop me from absorbing such power. It's too important to me, besides, you get more, so be generous. Don't be stingy like old Dumbledore. Luke saw that the Sorting Hat seemed to be able to peek into his mind at the system's harvesting of emotional power, and he felt a bit helpless. Although it didn't snatch much emotional value, the Sorting Hat's enjoyment and the strange looks from the crowd still made Luke forcefully take it off. The Sorting Hat seemed to have burped, having absorbed a lot of emotional value in that brief moment. Luke looked down at the Sorting Hat and said, although I know you need this power, I don't know where you are. And if you're in the headmaster's office, I can't get in without the principal's invitation. The Sorting Hat was silent for a moment, indicating understanding. Given how rich and unique the magic you provided is, I'll forgive you. However, I think it's better if you put me on your head, because with the nourishment of such peculiar magic, I feel like I'll undergo some special changes. Luke said to the Sorting Hat, speechless. Look at everyone's eyes, do you think you're suitable to be on my head? The Sorting Hat was unconcerned. What could be more attention-grabbing than the delicious food you make? Luke fell silent, then delivered a killing blow. But you do look a bit dirty. You know, as a chef, the most important thing is to keep the ingredients clean. If you're like this, I'm afraid people will misunderstand. The Sorting Hat fell silent. The kind of silence that was utterly complete. It was the first time he felt disliked. After a long while, the Sorting Hat, seemingly unable to bear the blow, flashed and reappeared in Dumbledore's hand, who had just appeared in the Great Hall. Only now, it was almost entranced, muttering incessantly. Dumbledore, I've been at Hogwarts for so many years, and none of you have ever tried to give me a good scrub. Don't I deserve to be treated seriously? If it weren't for how you treated me, why would I be disliked now? Dumbledore, I'm telling you, if you don't clean me thoroughly when we get back, I'm not working with you anymore. Dumbledore soothed the muttering Sorting Hat in his hand, then turned to look at Luke, who cast an apologetic glance, and smiled knowingly. It seemed that Luke's qualities were indeed very strong. To be able to attract the Sorting Hat so much, he hadn't expected Luke's qualities to be so good. He truly was a child who brought surprises. He scanned the entire hall, not seeing Harry and Ron, but he saw many professors and staff in the staff dining room praising the food endlessly. Dumbledore nodded, then gracefully took his center seat. Looking at the stone pot bibimbap on the seat before him, still steaming hot, kept warm by a warming charm, Dumbledore took a small taste. Immediately, he gave Luke an appreciative look, generous and full of praise. And when he tasted the unique honey lemonade beside it, he even happily squinted his eyes. Oh, what a meticulous young wizard. He slowly savored the unique texture and rich aroma of the stone pot bibimbap, occasionally taking a sip of the iced lemonade, feeling completely refreshed and invigorated. For an old fellow over 100 years old, what could be more satisfying than enjoying such a rich lunch in the middle of the day? His peripheral vision subtly swept across the entire Great Hall. He saw that almost 90% of the young wizards were eating Luke's stone pot bibimbap, while the large fish and meat prepared by the house elves were almost untouched. This made Dumbledore hesitate for a moment. Should he perhaps have the house elves learn some cooking skills too? They must keep up with the times. Minerva's side was too strict. It was hard to say if he would be able to eat Luke's dishes in the future. Perhaps he should invite Luke to the headmaster's office sometime. Perhaps he wouldn't be stingy with his culinary skills. Among the staff, the most eye-catching was probably Quirrell, who was usually timid, turban-clad, and not very articulate. At this moment, he had almost buried his entire head in the plate. Simply because in his mind, a cold voice was urging him. The power of soul nourishment, how interesting. Luke Graves, tilde. Useless, hurry up and eat with your dead mouth. Quirrell was on the verge of tears. He was practically shoveling food into his mouth with his hands. However, he dared not hesitate in the slightest regarding the cold, stern voice's instructions. As he consumed the stone pot bibimbap, Quirrell felt a warmth and invigoration subtly emerge within his increasingly weak soul. This made him steal a glance at Luke in the distance, filled with both fear and gratitude. But when he caught Dumbledore's seemingly casual gaze, his heart sank, and he quickly buried his head, continuing to devour his lunch. It must be said. Luke's lunch possessed enough magic. So much so that even the onlookers and professors didn't have time to judge. Everyone seemed to have intentionally or unintentionally forgotten to criticize and punish Luke's overstepping behavior. Watching the almost untouched lunches on the tables disappear completely, everyone savored the taste with satisfaction. Meanwhile, in the Hogwarts kitchen, the atmosphere was not so harmonious and optimistic. Winky and the other house elves looked at each other, their eyes filled with only surprise and fear. What do we do? This is the second time. What exactly is going on? Before, it was just Hufflepuff's breakfast that went untouched. Why was almost all the lunch returned by noon? Except for a few pumpkin pies from Slytherin that seemed to have a few bites taken out of them, the rest of the food was almost completely untouched. The atmosphere was oppressive and eerie. An older house elf said in a deep voice, "If this continues, we might be kicked out of Hogwarts." The other house elves immediately let out terrified screams. And one house elf pointed at a plate and said, "I don't know what was served on these plates, but I'm sure it wasn't made by us." The other house elves nodded in agreement. However, no matter how the older house elf inspected them, he couldn't find a single leftover crumb among the 100+ plates. The plates were even as clean as new, cleaner than if a dog had licked them. If it weren't for the lingering aroma that confirmed the plates had indeed held food, they would probably be in a chaotic mess by now. The plates removed from the principal's and staff's tables were likewise clean. Dumbledore's table even had an extra cup. Looking at the completely empty cup, a house elf dipped a finger into it, then finally licked it. The next moment, his eyes lit up quickly, then dimmed again. What a wonderful taste. I never thought this honey lemonade could be made so delicious, but how was it done? He grabbed his sparsely haired head and banged it against the stove. After a moment of contemplation, he suddenly jumped onto the kitchen counter, staring at everyone with a grave expression. "I think, perhaps it's time for us to make a change. Although I don't know exactly what happened, it's clear now that if we don't give it our all, we might lose this job. And once we're kicked out of Hogwarts, we'll be nothing. We've been working here for hundreds and thousands of years, generation after generation. Do you know the consequences of being thrown out?" The other house elves immediately trembled with fear. The older house elf then raised his arm and called out, "For dinner, I want you to give it your absolute best. We must be fully prepared. If we fail again, perhaps I'll have no choice but to resign to the principal." A fierce battle intent ignited in the eyes of the many house elves. For dinner, they were determined to make the most lavish meal. Ding! Congratulations, host, the stone pot bibimbap has harvested 700 positive emotional value from Dumbledore. Ding! Congratulations, host, the stone pot bibimbap has harvested 300 positive emotional value from Snape. At this moment, emotional prompts were directly flooding his mind. So much so that Luke had to block out these sounds, because even the picture frames and the soul bodies had more or less contributed a lot of emotional value to him. Luke was in a pleasant and comfortable mood. Relieved, he lightly wiped the sweat from his forehead. Hard work pays off. This lunch seemed to be a great success. And Professor McGonagall didn't seem to have a fit on the spot. Indeed, social etiquette is truly essential. With such a massive amount of emotional value, the speed of learning spells should be able to keep up now. Comfortable and refreshed, Luke put away his alchemy grimoire. He took out a compendium of basic spells and began to flip through it page by page. Sonorous. Simple. Expelliarmus. Very practical, I'll have a duel with Harry then. Stupefy. Good skill. Accio. Good. Next page. With the boost from emotional value, Luke's speed in learning spells was as if he had a cheat enabled. Page after page, he absorbed knowledge about spells. Whether it was pronunciation techniques, the angle of wand waving, or the lighting of magic nodes, Luke learned with ease. If others knew about Luke's learning speed, even in the wizarding world, he would surely be dissected and studied. In Transfiguration class, Ron and Harry finally breathed a sigh of relief. After a morning of continuous effort, although they didn't learn much, they finally got a good grasp of Hermione's highlighted points. Their hearts, which had been jumping up and down, now had the backing of knowledge, and they seemed less afraid. Watching more and more people enter the classroom, Harry and Ron exchanged glances. Today was their day to show off in front of everyone. Ron even started to look forward to the class. At this moment, he seemed to understand Hermione's usual proactive demeanor. After learning so much, if they didn't show it off in front of everyone, wouldn't it be unbearable? If young people aren't a little arrogant, are they still young people? Ron's gaze, for the first time, looked at Hermione with some approval. Hermione felt a little unnerved by his stare, and also a bit embarrassed. Today, Ron's eyes seemed to hold many different things. Hermione, who originally wanted to scold Ron, inexplicably couldn't bring herself to speak. Seeing Ron's admiration, she didn't know what she was thinking. Meanwhile, a figure entering in the distance made her pause. Today was a joint class for Hufflepuff and Gryffindor. However, the one who entered was Malfoy, with a slightly pale face and platinum blonde hair. Ron was about to scold him, but then seemed to remember something and sneered. Malfoy, are you here to clean the classroom? Everyone immediately tried hard not to laugh, but their slightly trembling shoulders betrayed their emotions. Malfoy's face grew even paler with anger, and he tightly gripped his wand, continuously waving it towards the blackboard and the classroom. Scourgify. To cope with this somewhat awkward situation, Malfoy almost exhausted his wit, forcing out this spell. It was precisely because of this that he barely managed to look less disheveled. Ron looked at Malfoy with a meaningful and somewhat reluctant expression. Are you done cleaning so quickly? Malfoy stood beside him, his face trembling with anger. Just then, a tabby cat suddenly appeared in the classroom and jumped onto the podium. The tabby cat seemed to have black stripe markings around its eyes, making it look like it was wearing glasses. Everyone was surprised, and Malfoy prepared to shoo it away. With a leap, the tabby cat suddenly appeared behind Malfoy. Mr. Malfoy, please return to your seat. Malfoy was startled, realizing it was Professor McGonagall. And she had transformed from a cat into a human. This immediately reminded him of Shyvana by Luke's side. However, he couldn't afford to let his mind wander at this moment. After all, Professor Snape required him to be present throughout potion class and transfiguration class. That is to say, wherever the two professors appeared, he had to appear. This also meant that his schedule was almost entirely filled with classes. This punishment, for this proud Slytherin, was even more terrifying than being severely beaten. Malfoy, Harry, and Ron's mutual antagonism had a long history. Although Malfoy's frustration made Ron somewhat excited, Professor McGonagall's gaze silenced everyone. Everyone knew what had happened in the morning, and they also knew the importance of this class. If they didn't want trouble, they had better sit up straight and keep their eyes forward. Professor McGonagall's eyes swept around, and seeing Luke flipping through the first volume of a compendium of basic spells in his hand, she couldn't help but shake her head slightly. This boy just couldn't let go of his cooking, what good was cramming now? However, the necessary strict requirements still needed to be enforced. Her gaze immediately swept over the students below as she asked them. What does everyone think of Luke's cooking skills? Everyone exchanged glances for a moment, and after a long silence, Hermione replied somewhat timidly. Luke's cooking is incredible, it's the best I've ever had. Seeing someone take the lead, everyone chimed in to agree. Professor McGonagall also nodded and slowly said. Then, does everyone find the transfiguration magic I just performed wondrous? The students nodded their heads vigorously. Transforming from a cat into a person, this peculiar magic filled the young wizards with a sense of wonder about magic. If they could transform into various animals, the mere thought of it made them excited enough to laugh. Professor McGonagall saw their imaginings and immediately waved her hand, signaling for silence. Just like Luke's cooking skills, being able to transform into an animal requires extremely high achievements in transfiguration. And today, I will begin your journey into transfiguration. Of course, before that, I need to ask a few questions to check whether you have diligently studied and prepared. The many young wizards immediately fell silent. Everyone had been busy eating lunch, who had time to review. Everyone instantly sat up straight, but their eyes were all directed toward their desks and their fingers, looking evasive. Professor McGonagall asked, what are the 5 principal Gamp's laws of transfiguration? As soon as she finished speaking, Hermione on the side shot up her right hand, her eyes filled with the eagerness to display her knowledge. However, Professor McGonagall turned to Harry nearby. Mr. Harry Potter, this question is for you. Harry was startled for a moment, then quickly composed himself. Fortunately, Hermione had already circled the answer to this question. He stood up, looked at Professor McGonagall somewhat sheepishly, and then began to answer. The first law of transfiguration is that food cannot be created out of thin air. The second one. Harry's voice rang clearly in everyone's ears. Professor McGonagall immediately showed a look of approval. Very good, Harry, you answered well. It seems you reviewed seriously. I am very impressed that you took my words to heart. 2 points to Gryffindor. Professor McGonagall did not hesitate to award points to Gryffindor. Malfoy in the distance wore a look of disdain. That Harry guy lucked out, only having to answer such a simple question. Professor McGonagall continued to ask. Who can help me answer? What is the historical progression of transfiguration? How did it evolve from ancient magic? Hermione raised her hand high once again, but Professor McGonagall's gaze fell upon Ron, who was currently looking at Hermione with approval. Mr. Ron Weasley, you seem very relaxed. Perhaps you could answer the current question. Ron immediately froze, looked left and right, and then looked up at Professor McGonagall with an inquiring gaze. Professor McGonagall nodded kindly. That's right, Weasley, it's you. Stand up. Since Mr. Harry Potter has already demonstrated sufficient skill for us, I assume you, as his friend, will not be lacking either. Ron felt as if his throat were constricted, but after a moment, he calmed down and tried hard to recall. Magic has a long history, said to be a gift from the gods. And the origin of magic gradually evolved from ancient totem worship and even the pursuit of power, until in the late stage, it developed into a system, using gestures, runes, and prayers to cast magic. Since the 12th century. Fortunately, Ron was genuinely interested in this knowledge. Now that he had started speaking, he explained everything clearly and logically. Professor McGonagall nodded repeatedly, her face full of relief. Excellent. Mr. Weasley, thank you for your wonderful answer. 3 more points to Gryffindor. Ron's eyes completely lit up. Awesome. Oh my goodness, so this is what it feels like to be a top student. That feeling of being the center of attention was just too great. Feeling Harry's approving gaze and hearing the applause unanimously given by the surrounding young wizards, Ron felt like he was floating. This feeling was truly wonderful. No wonder Hermione was so obsessed with knowledge. Meanwhile, Hermione wore a look of resentment. She had raised her hand twice already, so why hadn't Professor McGonagall asked her? She knew that besides Harry and Ron, she had also spoken up against Professor Snape, trying to take the blame for Luke. How could she be so biased? Gryffindor had lost points earlier because of their actions, and although Harry and Ron had earned the points back, she, who was always competitive, still wanted to earn points back through her own efforts. Her eyes were fixed intently on Professor McGonagall, filled with the desire to showcase her knowledge. Professor McGonagall, however, turned her gaze toward Luke nearby. Next, I need to ask Mr. Luke Graves some related knowledge. Luke Graves, I believe I reminded you this morning that I do not approve of you setting up a stall at school. Although the dishes you make are indeed delicious, the fundamental purpose of a student should be to study magic knowledge. I believe I have reminded you of this more than once. Luke nodded slightly. But your action of setting up a stall to sell stone pot bibimbap in the Great Hall at noon proves that you did not heed my words, correct? Although Professor McGonagall's tone was gentle, the entire class fell silent the moment she spoke those words. Oh boy. It's finally happening. Malfoy nearby was ecstatic, shouting internally. Punish him. Professor, hurry up and punish him. I can't be the only one doing toilet duty, Luke has to go too. However, just when everything was silent, the chair next to him suddenly rattled with a clang. Ron stumbled and fell directly onto the floor. There were crystalline tears in the corners of his eyes, and he looked completely petrified. Professor, what did you say? Luke, he cooked lunch today. Everyone nodded in unison. Ron, on the verge of tears, continued to ask. So, the entire school ate the lunch he made. The people around him nodded again, and Hermione gave him a sympathetic look. Harry was also speechless. After all, this was the sole motivation supporting Ron's frantic studying. Now they were telling him that while he was studying, everyone else had eaten the food Luke made, and only the 2 of them missed out. Ron immediately half knelt on the ground, despair flashing in his eyes. No. No. This can't be true. At this moment, he was completely broken. He had tried his absolute hardest, all for that single meal. Now they were telling him that despite trying his hardest, he had missed that meal. How could he possibly accept this? Ron's emotions fluctuated violently, and the slightly worn, second-hand wand in his hand seemed to sense its owner's intense feelings. The surrounding air suddenly dropped in temperature, and tiny snowflakes began to drift slowly through the air. Magic and emotion intertwined. A chill permeated the classroom, and 2 flakes of snow even landed on Professor McGonagall's glasses. Seeing Ron's desperate, inquiring gaze, Luke indicated that this matter was indeed true. Ron looked as if he had suffered a major blow, but the next moment, his eyes slowly focused, and he stood up amidst everyone's astonishment. Professor McGonagall, can I answer the question for Luke? At this moment, he seemed to have reached a realization. Since he didn't get to eat the food Luke made, he should at least prove that his effort wasn't wasted. Luke couldn't avoid this favor. Ron looked determinedly at Professor McGonagall. Professor McGonagall looked puzzled. Oh. Mr. Weasley, I'm afraid you can't do this. Ron listened to Professor McGonagall's reply, his eyes filled with persistence. Professor, I want to challenge my limits and weaknesses to prove that I have studied hard. Professor McGonagall nodded wryly. Mr. Weasley, I certainly see your serious attitude toward knowledge, but I'm afraid you really can't answer this question. Ron stood his ground, saying nothing. Professor McGonagall smiled helplessly. Very well then, Mr. Weasley, please demonstrate all the spells from the first volume of a compendium of basic spells. At this moment, among everyone present, perhaps only Luke nearly burst out laughing. Ron was willing to go through fire and water for his friend, he truly was a brave little lion. But he seemed to have overdone it slightly. As soon as this question was posed, the entire room fell silent, even Malfoy. Ron's confident expression instantly turned pale, then flushed red. Wait a minute. Is this the right way to approach things? It was like Professor McGonagall usually asked questions like, what is 1 plus 1? Why did the question jump straight to linear algebra when he tried to answer for Luke? Could he possibly know such a difficult question? His magic abilities were still almost entirely at the beginner stage. Although he was born into a wizard family and had witnessed a lot of magic, he truly hadn't practiced diligently. Ron was genuinely starting to panic. Not only did he not know the answer to this, but it was absolutely impossible for him to learn it. He really couldn't pull this off. Was showing off in front of people really this hard? Harry cast a sympathetic look from the side, while Hermione frowned, which was rare for her. Seriously, was such a difficult request really just a question? The first volume of a compendium of basic spells contained dozens of spells, and mastering each one required considerable effort and time. Who could master all of them so easily? One must know that this was a young wizard's entire year's worth of study. Even over the course of the entire school year, a typical young wizard mastering 60% of the spells was already considered excellent. Transfiguration class had only just begun, yet the professor was asking Luke to demonstrate the entire first volume. Wasn't this setting him up for failure? If it were her, she definitely couldn't do it either. Even Luke, she suspected, couldn't do it. This was too hard. No one believed Luke could accomplish this. Professor McGonagall looked at Luke beside her and asked with a smile. Mr. Luke, I believe we had an agreement previously. If you wanted to set up a stall at Hogwarts for a month, you had to master the first volume of a compendium of basic spells by the start of term. Do you remember this? Luke immediately nodded. Professor, of course I remember. Hearing Luke's words, Professor McGonagall felt a slight warmth in her heart. The boy's attitude toward admitting fault was quite good. Then she continued to ask, so, regarding today's lunch, and the commotion you caused earlier, may I consider this a violation of my rules? Therefore, you must accept punishment. Malfoy, standing nearby, was grinning ear to ear. It's happening, it's finally happening. Luke was finally going to be punished. Malfoy was extremely excited at this moment, completely ignoring the awkwardness of a little snake appearing in a class shared by two other houses. He stared intently at Professor McGonagall, wanting to see exactly how she would punish Luke. Hermione anxiously raised her hand. Professor McGonagall. Professor McGonagall gestured for her to speak. Hermione urgently said, Professor, I do not mean to offend your authority, but isn't mastering the entire first volume of a compendium of basic spells before the start of term a bit too harsh? I have only learned 4 spells myself so far. I don't think Mr. Luke can do it either. That requirement is too difficult. McGonagall nodded in agreement. She said to Hermione. But setting up a stall to cook food in the school also violates school rules. It would severely consume Mr. Luke Graves' study time. A young wizard should prioritize academics. I believe both you and Mr. Graves understand this. Hermione was instantly speechless and, at the professor's signal, sat back down. At this moment, Luke unhurriedly straightened his appearance, then looked toward Professor McGonagall. Professor, I remember our agreement was that as long as I could successfully demonstrate all the spells from the first volume of a compendium of basic spells during your transfiguration class, I would have the right to set up a stall at Hogwarts for 1 month, correct? Professor McGonagall nodded, a sudden feeling of dread stirring in her heart. But the difficulty was truly too high. She believed Luke absolutely could not do it. Malfoy, on the side, thought Luke was just posturing. Why is this guy still pretending at a time like this? I'll be waiting to see him cry. He had even prepared words to mock Luke. However, Luke said calmly, Professor, I can do it. This single sentence immediately caused the young wizards of both houses to erupt. Hannah Abbott sat far back in the classroom, her eyes filled with disbelief. How could that be possible? She herself had only mastered a mere 2 spells so far, and other young wizards had already praised her to the skies. How could learning the entire first volume be so easy? Furthermore, even if others didn't know, didn't she? Luke had been busy all day long. Although she didn't know that Luke was also the source of the instant noodle smell on the train, whether it was roasting potatoes in the Hufflepuff common room, selling buns in the morning, or making bibimbap at noon, Luke hadn't even had time to rest. With such a terrifying and heavy schedule, where did he find the time to study magic? Even if Merlin were reborn, he probably couldn't master it. Hermione nearby also gasped sharply. Good heavens! What was Luke talking about? How could this be possible? Although she already had high expectations for Luke, she figured his current ability was, at best, only slightly better than hers. No matter how heaven-defying his talent was, he couldn't possibly complete this in such a short time. Besides, the term had just started. Where did he get the time to learn so much? Hermione felt that Luke absolutely shouldn't have said that, yet she also felt that given his personality, if he said it, he must have confidence. She looked nervously at Luke, and Ron was even more agitated. He had originally intended to help Luke answer the question, but who knew Professor McGonagall would ask something so abstract and impossible? At this moment, he looked at Luke and whispered, Luke, don't force it. No one can answer a question like that. Why don't you just give in? Worst case scenario, Harry and I will run errands and sell your food for you later. For now, don't anger Professor McGonagall. Luke thanked Ron for his kindness, and Harry chimed in to persuade him. Exactly, Luke, don't push your luck. Professor McGonagall will truly be angry. Although Harry considered himself quite brave, he was definitely not as brave as Luke. It seemed there was absolutely no way to resolve the situation now. Professor McGonagall looked at Luke searchingly. Mr. Luke Graves, do you know what you are saying? Luke nodded slightly, speaking in a calm and determined tone. Professor McGonagall, I certainly know what I am talking about. Since it is an agreement, please allow me to demonstrate it to you. However, before that, I still hope to receive your authorization. Professor McGonagall frowned slightly. What is your request? Luke seized the opportunity and said, Professor McGonagall, if I can answer your question, I hope to receive a note signed by you, allowing me to go to the library managed by Madame Pants to look up knowledge regarding beacon magic, dragon, and ancient dragon magic. Professor McGonagall was instantly startled. Where did Luke hear about these things? One must know that it is almost impossible for a newly admitted young wizard to access this level of knowledge. Even for 5th and 6th year students, those who can grasp the basics of this knowledge are extremely rare. After all, the school's OWL's exams already drive them crazy, and few can persist in studying additional advanced magic. But can Luke, who has just been admitted, truly understand these things? She hesitated for a moment, but seeing Luke's sincere eyes, she felt a stir in her heart. Every time this child speaks, he exceeds her expectations. Whether it is his choice of wand, his talent in transfiguration, or the potion's mastery he displays in his cooking. Everything about Luke proves that he is a piece of glowing uncut jade. An excellent child like this must never be led astray. Professor McGonagall was silent for a moment, then slowly spoke. If you can do it, I can give you the note. However, if you want to fully study this knowledge, or even set up a stall, I naturally have other requirements. Luke nodded immediately, completely unsurprised. He was very clear that obtaining relevant knowledge inevitably requires paying a corresponding price. Seeing Professor McGonagall's gaze, Luke took a deep breath and gently waved his wand. The first one. Lumos. Lumos. A bright spot of light pulsed at the tip of the wand, growing larger and larger until it finally transformed into a dazzling ball of light, illuminating the entire classroom. Everyone was forced to squint. Professor McGonagall watched the extremely proficient casting of Lumos, and couldn't help but nod in praise. However, before anyone could react, Luke lightly waved his wand again, without even uttering the incantation. The next moment, several spots of light split from the wand and floated in midair. Hermione froze, her pupils slightly dilated, and her voice trembling. This is Lumos Maxima. Lumos Maxima. The advanced version of Lumos. Both the technique and the difficulty of learning far surpassed the ordinary illumination charm many times over. Professor McGonagall was also extremely shocked. She noticed that Luke's lips hadn't even moved. Non-verbal casting. Had this child actually practiced this basic spell to such an extent? How exactly did he do it? Then, Luke waved his wand again. Incendio. Incendio. A ball of blazing flame erupted in the air. Unlike others, Luke's flame grew from small to large with extreme regularity, demonstrating astonishing control, like turning a gas stove knob. Professor McGonagall pursed her lips. This level of control is something even older wizard cannot achieve. Boom. With an explosive sound, Luke's wand traced another trajectory. The spells changed continuously. Magic erupted in the air, and the air currents surged. Everyone collectively gasped, the sound rising wave after wave, and the temperature of the entire classroom seemed to rise by several degrees. Hermione struggled to lift her head and murmured, the 19th spell already. Luke had consecutively cast 19 spells, and they were all extremely proficient. Professor McGonagall couldn't help but nod, watching Luke's smooth, flowing movements, which were almost without pause, a pleasure to behold. All that remained in her heart was shock. This child before her was simply a monster. How exactly did he do it? Ron, standing nearby, was nearly in tears, his voice cracking. How is this possible? How is Luke so strong? Didn't they say he was born in the Muggle world? Then just how powerful was the talent he was displaying now? Ron could barely contain his emotions. When Luke finished casting the last spell, he suddenly stood up and asked incoherently. You were the one making instant noodles on the train back then, right? Luke paused, then nodded. It was me. Hannah Abbott in the distance had her eyes wide open. Right, why hadn't she thought of that? Who else but Luke could have made everyone on the train starving mad? Ron continued to ask. You were also the one roasting potatoes in the Hufflepuff common room, weren't you? Luke continued to nod. You were selling steamed buns this morning too. Luke still nodded. Then the stone pot bibimbap smell that Harry and I didn't get to eat during lunch study was also made by you. Luke nodded once more. Ron completely broke down. Then tell me, you used all that time to learn the entire first level of a compendium of basic spells. Luke looked slightly awkward, but still nodded. Ron's emotions were completely out of control. What else haven't you told me? He had originally thought he had found the truth leading to knowledge, which was to study desperately. But seeing Luke, who was like a monster of talent, he became utterly frantic at this moment. Having neither been able to help nor eaten lunch, he genuinely wanted an answer from Luke right now. Before Luke could speak, Professor McGonagall looked at Ron with a complex expression. Mr. Weasley, talent is indeed something that cannot be forced. Mr. Luke, he is truly unique. In the future, please do not compare yourself to him. She paused and added. I can tell you all that besides this, Luke's talent in transfiguration is also beyond imagination. Moreover, he also seems to possess outstanding talent in potions and herbology. The classroom instantly erupted. The young wizard all stared at Luke, feeling as if his figure was expanding infinitely before their eyes. What kind of ancient wizard reincarnation was this? Isn't Hufflepuff always known for being ordinary and gentle? Why is the style completely different when it comes to Luke? Malfoy, standing by the door, was now completely silent. He only felt as if a hurricane was sweeping through the room. Good heavens, how exactly did Luke manage this? As a noble, a pure-blood wizard young master from the sacred 28 families, he had never imagined that a wizard of Muggle background could be so outstanding. And he, Malfoy, had actually brazenly issued a duel challenge to Luke. He was supposed to duel Luke 1 month later. But the strength Luke displayed now already put him far out of reach. What could he possibly use to fight? Malfoy's face was as pale as paper, and the complexion that originally belonged to the House of Malfoy now seemed even more glaring. For the first time, he truly felt despair and powerlessness. He stumbled back to his seat, only he knew the complexity of his inner feelings. Professor McGonagall's gaze returned to Luke, her tone complex. Luke, how exactly did you do it? At this moment, all the young wizard, including Harry, Ron, and Hermione, held their breath. Their expressions were filled with shock and anticipation. If Luke truly had a secret manual, then this lesson would be an incredible gain for them. Naturally, the matter concerning the system could not be revealed. It seemed this act of showing off was now set in stone. Luke, however, waved his hand and said, "Professor, I merely flip through a compendium of basic spells during my free time, whenever I have a break from cooking. Gourmet food always brings inspiration, and the intervals between cooking are when my inspiration is most abundant. This time is perfect for studying magic knowledge. I believe you can also see this efficiency." Silence surrounded them. Besides silence, there was only more silence. Professor McGonagall felt a little dry-mouthed, unsure what to say. "So, you only learned all this in your free time?" Luke's expression was extremely serious. "Of course, Professor." "You." Professor McGonagall shook her head helplessly. Even though she felt she had overestimated Luke's potential more than once, at this moment, she still felt she had underestimated him. Compared to Harry, the savior who had just started school, Luke was as dazzling as the sun. Other young wizards were simply not worth mentioning when compared to Luke. With a complex gaze, Professor McGonagall instructed the remaining young wizards to begin today's transfiguration class. The transfiguration charm. Veriverto. A matchstick transformed into a silver needle. Professor McGonagall signaled for Luke to demonstrate to everyone. Luke slightly waved his wand, and the matchstick instantly transformed directly into a tiny silver needle. To ensure everyone could see clearly, Luke used an enlargement spell, and the silver needle continuously grew larger. Under everyone's astonished gaze, the details changed one by one. The shape of the central hole, the internal structure, and the surface color and pattern were all constantly shifting. Everyone felt a deep sense of helplessness for a moment, while Professor McGonagall's expression was complex. She waved her wand, and emerald green text appeared sequentially on a piece of parchment, which shot directly into Luke's hand. Luke saw that it was Professor McGonagall's written authorization. He was overjoyed. Sure enough, the professor highly valued her integrity. At the same time, Professor McGonagall did not stop but came up beside Luke. "As you know, I only approved you to set up a stall for 1 month. And studying this knowledge will take up a lot of your time. If you want to continue running the stall, you must learn a new magic spell." Luke looked at Professor McGonagall in surprise. "Professor, what is it?" Professor McGonagall smiled. Although this child is devoted to cooking, his love for knowledge is also sincere. But the smile on her face carried a hint of inexplicable meaning, causing Luke's heart to skip a beat. At this moment, Professor McGonagall also made up her mind. This spell is called Stone Golem Mobilization. Pertum Locomotor. All the details of the spell immediately appeared on the parchment in Luke's hand. Luke glanced over it. Only then did he realize that the complexity of Stone Golem Mobilization was far more terrifying than he had imagined. This was not a single spell, but an extremely complex composite magic, combining alchemy, mechanics, transfiguration, as well as magic power storage and summoning charms. So this was why only Professor McGonagall was able to use this spell. This brings us to its operational logic. All the stone statues in Hogwarts, including the suits of armor placed in the school corners, are actually combinations of alchemical magic and mechanical capabilities. Complex transfiguration magic is then cast, allowing these non-biological puppets to move flexibly. Adding summoning magic for remote control, and finally sufficient magic power storage. These puppets all have magic power stored within them. Every wizard who inherits this special ability of Hogwarts must learn this knowledge. And completely replace their own magic power into the puppet. That is why its usage results in such a magnificent and grand spectacle. It can be said that this is absolutely the peak and the highlight moment of a wizard. No wonder Professor McGonagall was so happy after using this magic. Isn't this the control of a humanoid Gundam? After listing all the knowledge required for stone golem mobilization, Professor McGonagall looked at Luke. I have no other requirements for you. To gain special privileges at Hogwarts, you naturally have to put in more than double the effort of others. Since you possess such excellent learning talent, not utilizing it would be a waste. Starting today, you have the qualification to learn this spell. I will also report this to Dumbledore. Following Professor McGonagall's words, they heard her lightly call out, "Books Accio." Accio book. Luke knew that these were books summoned by a targeted Accio, and should be Professor McGonagall's personal belongings. Only books that personally belonged to her and had a relevant magical connection could be summoned using a non-directional Accio. However, after Professor McGonagall finished speaking, the surroundings did not immediately change. Professor McGonagall changed the subject. Since you have this talent, don't waste it. I approve of you running a stall at school, but you also need to complete these learning tasks. If you can complete all the magic studies, I will recommend you to the school board for a position as a resident professor. The surrounding young wizards immediately burst into an uproar. Shortly after the school year began, someone might speed run the entire school curriculum and receive an invitation to stay on staff. This world was too fantastical. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh tilde. The classroom door burst open, and books trailing comet-like streaks of light flew madly towards McGonagall and Luke, stopping abruptly. Bang, bang, bang. Book after book landed on Luke's desk, eventually reaching a height several heads taller than Luke himself. Looking at the ancient, brick-like books, Professor McGonagall pointed at them and said, "Mr. Luke, as long as you can complete the study of these books, the right to use this spell will be yours. You will also have the qualification to run a stall at the school. Of course, you need to create and use it yourself from scratch. I trust you won't disappoint me." Professor McGonagall had put great thought into this. To make Luke settle down and study, she had practically brought out half of her most treasured knowledge. Large-scale magic like stone golem mobilization would be enough to keep Luke busy for a long time. Judging by Luke's love for books, even with such terrifying magical talent displayed, he would likely still need a long time to study. Whether it was alchemical magic, magical machinery, magical core creation and charging, or the study of transfiguration and magical summoning, these domains were enough to immerse Luke and slowly make him forget his culinary skills. The surprises Luke brought today were truly too numerous, so much so that Professor McGonagall couldn't fully process them all at once. It seemed another conversation with Dumbledore was absolutely necessary. Luke happily gathered the books, and the alchemy magic in his hand transformed once more. He instantly bundled and applied a seal to the piles of books. Luke frowned, realizing that not having the extension charm was truly inconvenient. He could only use the alchemy grimoire to seal them. After all, these books involved school secrets. If he didn't seal them, Professor McGonagall would probably have to lecture him for a long time. Seeing Luke's actions, Professor McGonagall immediately showed an expression of approval. This child understands things immediately, he truly is extremely intelligent. Little did she know, the system in Luke's mind sounded again. Ding! Congratulations, host, you have triggered Task 5. Complete all studies related to stone golem mobilization, and successfully create a matching puppet army. Reward: Dark Lord's 3-piece set. Avada Kedavra Curse. Imperio. Crucio. Good heavens. At this moment, Luke could only exclaim, "Good heavens." Was the system's reward for this mission a bit too outrageous? The Dark Lord's 3-piece set, could such a thing really appear on the reward page? Was the system trying to force him down the path of the Dark Lord? Luke cleared his head and looked back at Professor McGonagall. At least he had passed the current hurdle. The most urgent task, besides this massive amount of magic learning, was to first complete the study of beacon magic and Shyvana's dragon bloodline awakening. While he had the chance, he would also ponder the extension charm and the vanishing cabinet. Every day was so difficult for him. Everyone spent the first transfiguration class of the afternoon in a daze. However, everyone looked at Luke as if he were a monster. This guy's astonishment really made them doubt life a bit. However, the second class was Charm's class. Professor Phileas Flitwick, as the Dean of Ravenclaw. His strength was naturally not to be underestimated. As a champion of several consecutive dueling competitions, this professor with goblin bloodline was naturally exceptionally strong. Phileas Flitwick demonstrated the levitation charm to all the young wizards. Wingardium Leviosa. Wingardium Leviosa. Professor Flitwick's wand tip gently glided. Then a pure, flawless feather lightly floated up. It moved like a pleasing wave with Professor Flitwick's actions. Immediately, Professor Flitwick explained the techniques and magic nodes of this charm to everyone. Hermione, standing nearby, suddenly understood, and the next moment, as she moved, the feather completely floated up. Ron was frantically waving his wand next to her, and Hermione immediately shook her head, correcting Ron's movements, which made Ron a little annoyed. However, when he saw Luke next to him intently flipping through a magic book, he immediately shut his mouth. Even more excellent people were still working hard, he had no right to complain. Flitwick naturally noticed this. Miss Hermione Granger's precise operation deserves praise. Let's award Gryffindor 1 point. Then his gaze turned to Luke, who was nearby. Seeing everyone looking at Luke with great anticipation, Professor Flitwick immediately pointed at Luke and said, "Mr. Graves, could you also demonstrate the technique of the levitation charm for us?" Luke nodded compliantly. Ron, who was nearby, immediately muttered. Why pick Luke of all people? Isn't this just openly letting him show off in front of everyone? As expected, Luke's precise and flawless operation greatly impressed Flitwick. Amidst the young wizard's chattering explanations, Flitwick finally realized just how much of a monster Luke truly was. Not only was his cooking delicious, but to what extent had his charm's talent reached? Boom tilde. With a loud explosion, Seamus Finnegan's feather exploded into dust. Mr. Finnegan, making a feather explode is absolutely not allowed. Luke's eyes lit up. Wasn't this the genius of explosions? Perhaps he could make use of him later when learning offensive magic. Luke opened his panel. Host. Luke Graves. Culinary skill. Culinary rank. SS. Magic rank. E. Charm rank. D. Transfiguration rank. D. Potion rank. A-. Culinary bonus. Alchemy rank. D. Blacksmith bonus. Defense rank. E. Culinary bonus. White magic rank. F. Dark arts rank. C. Culinary bonus. Currently incomplete long-term missions. Mission 1. Path to Godhood. 5 jobs a day, a quasi-god of cookery is so relaxed. Progress 99.3, 100 reward. A set of legendary cooking utensils. Mission 2. All-Night Warrior. Continuously selling late-night snacks at Hogwarts for 1 academic year, can obtain 100% replication ability of one of the sacred artifacts repeatable. Mission 3. Surrounded by attendants. Handmaiden Night Order current members activated, 1/200th reward. Magic bonus x1. Mission 4. Dragon Guardian. Help Shyvana enhance her extremely thin ancient ice fire dragon bloodline. Reward. Dual animagus forms. Mission 5. Master of Both Worlds. Complete all learning of Stone Golem mobilization, and successfully create a matching puppet army. Reward. Dark Lord's 3-piece set. Besides the system's missions, Beacon Magic, Ancient Dragon Magic, and the Vanishing Cabinet all needed to be put on the agenda. It was time for a vigorous study session. It could be said that these days of schooling were even more tiring than working. Luke's eyes drooped slightly, and he thought to himself, I'll skip dinner this afternoon for now, my target, the library. Good afternoon, Madam Pants. Madam Pants, who was cleaning with a feather duster, immediately smiled. Good afternoon, Luke, Pants responded with a nod. To be honest, she was extremely surprised by this young wizard named Luke. Ever since a few days ago, when this child came with Professor McGonagall's note to look at high-level magic content, Madam Pants had doubtfully provided him with the relevant books. She originally thought that upon seeing those ancient magic books thicker than his head, Luke, being only a first year, would surely be overwhelmed. And even give up very quickly. But she didn't expect it. Luke actually plunged into the pile of books, studying until late at night every time. Luke would only stop when Madam Pants personally kicked him out. Madame Pants was very pleased with this young wizard, who seemed almost possessed. After all, children who respected knowledge so much were rare, and what she liked most were wizards who genuinely loved learning. The surrounding magic lights emitted a soft glow, illuminating the desk to a pristine white, greatly enhancing the reading experience. Luke closed an ancient dragon magic book as thick as a brick, his eyes filled with contemplation. The boost from exchanging emotional value these past few days had increased his learning speed dozens of times. He had completely devoured beacon magic, and his research into knowledge related to ancient dragons was almost complete. Luke had some conjectures about Shyvana's ancient dragon bloodline awakening, but this still required reading more knowledge for verification. As for the extension charm, although the charm was very difficult to learn, Luke, with his charm learning bonus, naturally didn't find it too hard. However, this charm was easy to learn, hard to master. Constructing simple spatial extension magic circuits wasn't a big problem. But once it involved slightly more advanced spatial extension, it became somewhat difficult. Luke understood that this required more knowledge of space to support it, otherwise, the constructed space would quickly collapse and dissipate. At present, insufficient total magic power was the main reason hindering the progress of this charm. In the entire British wizarding world, the most authoritative figure, at least overtly, had to be Newt Scamander, who graduated from Ravenclaw. Luke thought it would be great if he could consult him. But it was highly unlikely to meet him, as he was constantly wandering around for magical creatures. However, it wasn't impossible. In all of Hogwarts, when it came to raising magical animals, the entire school combined couldn't compare to Newt. But for the extension charm, Luke felt that Dumbledore definitely had a place among the masters of spatial extension. With a plan in mind, Luke immediately felt relieved. However, all these matters had to be put on hold for now. Tomorrow was Professor Snape's potion class. His previous encounter with Professor Snape could hardly be called friendly. To ensure potion class went smoothly, Luke felt he needed to focus on the potion textbook tonight. After all, with the quasi-god of cookery's culinary bonus, his potion learning speed shouldn't be too slow. This was certified by the system. During dinner, Harry and Ron looked eagerly at the Hufflepuff long table in the distance, scanning it several times from beginning to end, but couldn't find Luke. Harry was immediately disappointed. Another day without good food. Ron listlessly stared at the pumpkin pie in front of him, his eyes somewhat glazed over. Without Luke's cooking, how could he possibly eat this? Harry nodded in agreement. After all, Luke's dedication to studying lately had been overwhelming. He and Ron had run into Luke engrossed in the library more than once. When they went in the morning, Luke was studying. When they went in the afternoon, Luke was still studying. Even Hannah Abbott of Hufflepuff said that the young wizards of Hufflepuff could only find Luke's little stall late at night in the empty common room. As for what they could eat, it all depended on Luke's mood. This made Ron feel terribly uncomfortable, as if he were being bitten by ants. Why couldn't I be a Hufflepuff? Ron murmured. He and Harry had only been back at school for a few days. Yet they had already snuck out several times at night. Filch and Madame Norris had been patrolling more and more frequently recently. If they were caught and Gryffindor lost a large number of points, they would become historical sinners. However, they truly missed the food Luke made. Ron held his fork and kept stabbing the pumpkin pie in front of him, but had no intention of actually swallowing a bite. After a long while, Ron looked up at Harry. "I'm full, how about you?" Harry nodded somewhat mechanically. Ron looked at Harry and said, "Tonight I'm going to find Fred and George to see what new tricks they've come up with. Harry, do you want to come?" Harry paused, then shook his head and said, "You go ahead, I won't. I need to go to the Owl Tower to feed Hedwig." The two nodded at the same time and left. Meanwhile, in the kitchens next to the Hufflepuff common room, the slightly older house elf was leading the other house elves in counting the plates. They were checking the dining status of the young wizards and the staff. Seeing that some people's plates were empty, especially on the Slytherin side, where many items had been completely consumed, the house elves cheered once again. "To our great success. For 3 consecutive days, our food has finally received everyone's approval again, and it's clear that everyone is eating more and more. Tomorrow, please keep up the good work." The house elves encouraged each other, as if they had already won the final victory. On the other side, Professor McGonagall was taking a walk after dinner when she saw Harry and Ron walking out of the Great Hall. When the two saw Professor McGonagall, they wanted to hurry away like mice spotting a cat. But what they feared came true. Professor McGonagall called out to the two of them. "You two, have you eaten?" Harry and Ron nodded slightly awkwardly, thinking Professor McGonagall was about to lecture them. Instead, they heard McGonagall ask, "I heard Luke has been studying very seriously and diligently lately. Your relationship with him should be good, so I wanted to ask you about him." Harry and Ron exchanged glances, and Ron couldn't help but complain. "Professor, he's more than just serious and diligent, that guy is completely obsessed. He's studying frantically, clutching books thicker than his head. He must have taken feet worth of notes, just looking at it gives us a headache." Professor McGonagall immediately nodded with satisfaction. This child, Luke, was finally on the right track. Sure enough, he had been idle before because the difficulty level set for him was too low. Although the current situation also made Professor McGonagall slightly worried. Worried that Luke might be studying too much. But compared to Luke promoting culinary culture all over the school, Professor McGonagall felt that this small risk was worth taking. Just as Harry and Ron were trying to sneak away, Professor McGonagall spoke again. "Stop. Why are you running so fast?" Although they were about to leave Professor McGonagall's sight, upon hearing her words, the two reluctantly turned back. Professor McGonagall said gently, "Luke is studying so seriously. As Gryffindor students, you cannot fall too far behind either. Of course, you can't compare yourselves to Luke." Ron pursed his lips, and Harry nodded. Did Professor McGonagall even know what she was talking about? A powerhouse like Luke was rare, even in the history of Hogwarts. The two had braced themselves for a lecture, but Professor McGonagall suddenly changed the subject. "Luke should still be studying right now, shouldn't he? That won't do. If he doesn't eat dinner, he'll wear himself out eventually." Harry and Ron were instantly stunned. Why had the conversation suddenly turned to eating dinner? It was fine when it wasn't mentioned, but the moment dinner was brought up, their stomachs immediately started protesting. Compared to others, Harry and Ron were closer to Luke, and they had eaten his delicious food more often. In fact, they hadn't swallowed much of the afternoon's dinner. Hearing the words, Luke, and dinner, now, the greedy worms in their stomachs began to stir. Looking at their expressions, Professor McGonagall immediately frowned and scolded them. "What are you staring at? Go to the dining hall, get a portion of food, and take it back to Luke. Also tell him that the task assigned to him is indeed too arduous, and it's alright if he can't finish it immediately." The two nodded mechanically, glancing at Professor McGonagall from time to time, afraid she might suddenly remember something else and call them back. Inside the Great Hall, Harry and Ron held a package, which naturally contained the dinner packed for Luke. However, at this moment, the two looked at each other. They finally had a night without homework, and now they were being sent to the library. Both immediately put on their masks of suffering. Ron looked at the package and said, "Harry, you know I have to go find George and Fred. Besides, for something like delivering dinner, it's not even certain Luke will eat it. After all, how can the house elves' cooking compare to Luke's cooking?" Harry certainly knew that, but he didn't want to go to the library either. So he said to Ron, "What about my owl? Hedwig hasn't been fed in 2 days. If I don't go soon, I'm afraid Hedwig will starve to death in the Owl Tower." As the two were shoving each other, they happened to run into Hannah Abbott passing by. At this moment, she was preoccupied with worry. After thinking it over and over, she felt that Luke's cooking skills were truly superb. If she could learn a few cooking techniques from Luke, perhaps the Leaky Cauldron's business would improve in the future. Although the Leaky Cauldron was the gateway to Diagon Alley, many wizards passed through. But relying solely on that bit of butterbeer no longer seemed to attract anyone's interest. However, Hannah Abbott had waited in the common room for several nights but never saw Luke. The only time she managed to corner Luke while he was making a late-night snack, the snack was so delicious that she completely forgot her main objective for a while. Hannah Abbott was very distressed. But Luke was currently studying in the library, would it be too presumptuous to go look for him? Harry and Ron, still shoving each other, bumped into Hannah Abbott. Hannah immediately looked up at the two of them. She then heard their conversation. Hannah's eyes immediately lit up. Is that for Luke? How about I deliver it? Hannah proactively took on the responsibility. Although Harry and Ron were taken aback, they still handed the dinner over without hesitation. Are you kidding? They absolutely refused to go to a place like the library. They wouldn't go, even if it killed them. Hannah left, beaming. She murmured to herself. Luke is truly hard to find. With this dinner, I have an excuse. But, Luke, he hasn't already made his own food, has he? The speaker had no intention, but the listener took it to heart. Hannah Abbott left the great hall with light steps. Meanwhile, Harry and Ron's eyes simultaneously flickered. They both realized one thing. Sneaking into the Hufflepuff common room for a late-night snack in the middle of the night was simply too difficult. But Luke had been studying maniacally these past few days and couldn't find any other time to cook. However, Luna's words made both of their eyes light up. That's right. Luke is also human. It was this late, and he hadn't eaten dinner yet. Wouldn't he be hungry? If he were to cook for himself, perhaps the library truly would be an option. However, since the two had just been shying away from the task, they both felt a bit awkward now. Harry immediately raised his hand and waved awkwardly at Ron, saying, I'm going to check on the owls then. Ron also nodded, muttering, I wonder what George and Fred want from me. The two left in opposite directions, yet both were pondering the possibility of a late-night snack. In any case, they had to go to the library. What if Luke cooked something and they missed it? Wouldn't that be a huge loss? The stars were brilliant, and the moonlight was clear. Fish scale-like ripples spread across the black lake. Madame Pants yawned. The library was about to close. Usually at this time, the library was already empty. But recently, there was the unshakable Luke, Hermione who seemed to be competing next to him, and some young wizards preparing for their OWLs who seemed infected by the atmosphere. They seemed to have formed a certain unspoken agreement. None of them would leave. Madame Pants felt somewhat gratified, then shook her head. Never mind, in a little while, when most people had left, she would just tell Luke to leave early. If she didn't shoo this child out, he definitely wouldn't leave on his own. This gap was the perfect time to make a trip to the Owl Tower. The owls had just brought a letter saying that the new books required by the library had been delivered from Flourish and Blots. However, because the weight of the shipment was too great, even several owls working together couldn't deliver it, so she had to go herself. Before leaving, Madame Pants turned and tapped her feather duster against the many young wizards, saying, Please mind the time and get some rest early. Health is the capital for revolution, and tomorrow's studies are still very important. Upon hearing this, some young wizards packed up their bags. Madame Pants was extremely pleased by this. Immediately after, she looked toward Hermione in the distance and said, Miss Granger, I hope you can help me maintain order. Hermione looked up from afar at Luke, who was near the edge of the restricted section, and then nodded to Madame Pants. But just as Madame Pants left, a witch with wavy brownish-yellow long hair, who was not particularly tall, walked in holding several books. Seeing this, everyone bowed and greeted her. Professor Pomona Sprout. Sprout nodded in response, but the books tucked under her arm fell onto Madame Pants's administrative desk. Is Pants not here? Hermione Granger quickly looked up and said. Madame Pants went to the Owl Tower to retrieve books. If you need something, you might have to wait a little longer. Sprout immediately nodded. She scanned the library at night. The young wizards who remained were almost all the ones she expected. And when her gaze fell upon Luke near the restricted section, her eyes immediately lit up. This child truly loves studying. Unlike several other professors, Sprout was actually very kind in person. Although she was the dean of Hufflepuff House, her presence was actually not very noticeable. Precisely because she was usually devoted to magical botany and cooking, she rarely managed the trivial affairs of the house. When she saw Luke, who was almost overshadowing the newly enrolled Harry Potter, the savior, she immediately became interested. If her expectations were correct, this child's talent was even significantly stronger than that of Cedric, who was in third year. Sprout slowly paced toward Luke's desk. Hermione, watching Professor Sprout's expression from afar, couldn't help but purse her lips. Sure enough, the strong always attract the attention of the strong. Professor Sprout didn't even spare her a glance, walking straight toward Luke. A soft gasp of surprise rang out, drawing everyone's attention. Sprout stared intently at the book in front of Luke. The yellowed pages surprised her somewhat. Aside from the massive tomes about ancient dragons, spatial magic, and even beacon magic, subjects that even upperclassmen wouldn't easily touch upon. What surprised Sprout the most was this. On Luke's desk was actually a copy of The Grafting of Magical Herbs and the Transformation of Potion Properties. If she remembered correctly, this book was a genuine antique. Sprout vaguely recalled that she had only encountered this book after becoming a house professor, yet Luke was already studying it now. She was instantly surprised. Luke, who had just exhaled, looked up at Sprout and was also slightly surprised. He hadn't expected the dean of his own house to inspect the work at this hour, and he immediately offered Sprout a smile. Sprout, however, waved her hand dismissively, pointing at the book and asking, "Luke, I want to ask you, why are you reading this herbology book?" Luke immediately smiled. "Dean, as you know, what interests me most is cooking. And in my opinion, this herbology book perfectly demonstrates many different combinations of medicinal herbs, allowing them to release unique flavors. For a chef, this is undoubtedly a treasure trove." Hearing this, Sprout immediately nodded in agreement. Luke, meanwhile, rubbed his forehead. After studying maniacally for the past 2 days, all the knowledge had been completely absorbed by him, but the corresponding cost was that his accumulated emotional value was almost entirely depleted. To maintain the previous study speed, he needed to gain more emotional value. Thinking of this, Luke's focused, absorbed emotion finally dispersed. But what followed was a strong feeling of hunger. Darn it! I forgot to eat dinner again. Luke couldn't help but shake his head. It looked like he would have to make up for it with a late-night snack when he returned to the Hufflepuff common room tonight. However, upon hearing Luke's words, Pomona Sprout did not seem to intend to leave. Instead, she said to Luke, "Speaking of cooking, I am also very fond of it. And coincidentally, I have a little knowledge in the field of herbology. I look forward to us having a chance to collaborate." Luke's eyes immediately brightened. Professor Sprout was being too modest. One must know that in the realm of herbology, even the old man Dumbledore probably couldn't compare to her in all of Hogwarts. After all, this was such a niche domain. Unlike potion making, which has high demand, it was only old professors like Sprout, who had immersed herself for decades, who could discern many special combinations. Thinking of this, Luke immediately looked up and met Professor Sprout's gaze. Sparks of thought seemed to be reflected in their eyes. Luke and Professor Sprout blurted out almost simultaneously, "Why don't we try it right now?" Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and support our channel.